The reality on the ground, I think, is perhaps what we should be guided by. And a second night without strikes indicates that some sort of ceasefire is in place, and the Qataris have told their shipping that they can, as of today, go back to sea again, taking the proper safety and security precautions. It's painting a better picture, but it's far from solved, of course.
We have more breaking news this evening. The U.S. military said it boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea today as part of its blockade of Iranian ports. U.S. Central Command says that the naval blockade against Iran remains in full effect. Now, it all comes even as, for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, neither the U.S. nor Iran seem to carry out serious attacks overnight. But the apparent pause in strikes does not mean the conflict is any less fraught, as a new front is emerging in the war, this time in the Red Sea. This morning, Iranian-backed rebel group the Houthis attacking Saudi Arabian targets on the coast. CNN senior White House reporter Betsy Klein joins us now. Betsy, what's the latest here?
Well, Danny, the short answer is we just don't know how much to read into what appears to be a pause in strikes in Iran. A relatively quiet night last night after 13 consecutive nights of U.S.-launched strikes. But this comes after U.S. intelligence agencies had assessed in recent days that the types of limited strikes that the U.S. had been carrying out were unlikely to shift Iran's negotiation position. President Trump, in his view, does not believe that Iran is ready yet to come to the table and negotiate in a meaningful way. He also offered some view into his headspace yesterday. Listen.
Look, we're talking to them right now. I think they're getting more and more serious as the days go by, for maybe the obvious reason. But we are talking to them right now. Look, there are two ways. I consider that the smarter way, but the other is probably the easier way, doing what we're doing. And we can take that to a much higher level if we want to. We're prepared to do that, as you know. We're locked and loaded.
Now, just about 5 months into this war, the president has limited options. He can pursue that diplomatic path, which after that ceasefire and memorandum of understanding have totally broken down, have really proven to not yet be successful. He can maintain the status quo, these limited strikes, as I mentioned earlier, or he can escalate. The president has previewed the possibility of really ramping up with attacks on critical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, Karg Island, that key oil hub, as well as the possibility of strikes on Pickaxe Mountain, which is believed to be an Iranian nuclear set. But as we are trying to ascertain what exactly to make of this apparent pause in strikes, a senior U.S. official telling me, quote, President Trump has always been clear that his preference is diplomacy, but he has shown Iran what will happen if they fail to come to the table in a serious way. The clear question right now is whether whether President Trump believes that that bar is being met for some serious diplomacy going forward. But this is clearly a moment of extreme political pressure on the president. Public opinion shows that this war is deeply unpopular with the American people. Gas prices ticking up to $4.11 a gallon, according to AAA on average. And the midterms are now just 3 months away. So all of that weighing on President Trump as he plots a path forward, Danny.
Yeah, weighing on the president indeed. All right, Betsy Klein, thank you so much for that reporting as always. Appreciate it. And we're joined now by retired U.S. Army Major General Randy Manner. He served as the Deputy Commanding General of the U.S. Third Army in Kuwait. General, good to have you here this evening. From a military perspective, what does it signal to you that there were no reported strikes from either side, really, overnight?
Well, it's always good that hopefully there's a de-escalation. That's always good for both sides. The other side of the coin is that is also a precursor to perhaps preparing for much larger strikes to come. So I think in addition to what was said by the previous reporter, it is very likely because the status quo attacks the United States has been doing have had minimal to no impact on shifting the Iranian position and getting them to the bargaining table.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, because for almost 2 weeks straight, right, the U.S. conducted nightly strikes against Iran. What do you see, if anything, was achieved during that period? Because, I mean, I guess if it resulted in this de-escalation, that's one thing, but it doesn't seem like much came of that, no?
It was a complete waste of armaments, a complete waste of lives on both sides. And the result is that we now, it's been verified and validated by the Iranians that our president, unfortunately, is a paper tiger. He threatens constantly, but the reality is he has been unsuccessful in bringing the Iranians to the table. Quite frankly, I think the president's desperate to get back to the day before he started this war, and he'd be very happy with having this strait reopened. Remember, by his own words, he said that we've destroyed the Iranians' capability to enrich uranium. Twice he has said this already.
For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, neither country seemed to exchange strikes overnight. But the U.S. and Iran are still at odds and contradicting one another about the current state of talks. Plus, in the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. military says it boarded a tanker today as part of its blockade of Iranian ports. And the conflict is still at risk of widening with a new front emerging in the Red Sea. This morning, the Iran-backed Houthis struck Saudi Arabian targets on the coast there. For more on all of this, CNN senior White House reporter Betsy Klein joins us now. Betsy, tell us, what's the latest you're hearing from the administration about this war?
Well, Danny, we know that President Trump spent part of his Friday huddling with top advisors and cabinet officials to discuss the possibility of an escalation in his war with Iran. But then Friday night into Saturday, a relatively quiet night with an apparent pause in that fighting after 13 consecutive nights of strikes. It's not clear at this point how much we should be reading into that pause, but it comes after the U.S. intelligence community had assessed that the strikes that the U.S. had been carrying out on Iran were unlikely to shift Iran's negotiation position, according to two sources familiar with the matter. Now, President Trump has said that he does not believe that Iran is ready to come to the negotiation table. He has also been threatening massive attacks, but he offered some vision into his headspace yesterday. Listen.
Look, we're talking to them right now. I think they're getting more and more serious as the days go by, for maybe the obvious reason. But we are talking to them right now. Look, there are two ways. I consider that the smarter way, but the other is probably the easier way, doing what we're doing. And we can take that to a much higher level if we want to. You know, we're prepared to do that, as you know. We're locked and loaded.
Now, as the president weighs a path forward, he really has limited options here. He can pursue that path of diplomacy, which has not yet been successful after that memorandum of understanding and ceasefire fell apart in recent weeks. He could continue the status quo of these limited strikes, or he could escalate. And he has threatened attacks on critical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, that key oil hub of Karg Island, as well as possibilities of strikes on Pickaxe Mountain, which is believed to be an Iranian nuclear site. Now, we're trying to ascertain what to make of this pause in strikes. I asked the White House what their view is. I spoke with a senior official who said, quote, President Trump has always been clear that his preference is diplomacy, but he has shown Iran what will happen if they fail to come to the table in a serious way. The key question now is whether the Trump administration believes that that bar is being met, Danny.
All right, Betsy Klein, thank you so much for the latest on that situation. For more on this, we're joined now by Democratic Representative Greg Stanton of Arizona. He serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I want to begin with the latest on Iran. Do you see a window of opportunity for negotiations in this apparent pause in strikes?
Any opportunity the president might have to get to a negotiated solution is the right step. But remember, while they may be temporarily pausing the attacks on Iran now, the Iranian proxy, the Houthis, were able to successfully strike an oil refinery in Saudi Arabia, thereby continuing to expand this war, the theater of this war. So it is critically important that we end this war as soon as possible.
Congressman, U.S. Central Command is saying that it boarded a tanker today as part of its larger blockade of Iranian ports. How long, from your perspective, can the U.S. keep up this blockade?
Look, when we left Washington, D.C. on Thursday, we voted over $70 billion more for this war. No Democrats supported it. It was the Republicans that completely, without question, gave so many more dollars to continue to fight this war. It's completely unacceptable. We've lost 18 soldiers. And now the Houthis, I mentioned the strike on the oil refinery, Saudi, are also threatening to shut down the Red Sea for oil tankers as well. Look, the intelligence community told the president all of these things were virtually inevitable if he engaged in this war of choice. The president chose to ignore him. He pretended like none of this was foreseeable. All of it was foreseeable. his decision-making has been some of the worst that we have seen by a president during a wartime.
All right, we're also watching a new war front emerge in the Middle East conflict. New video shows smoke rising from an oil facility in Saudi Arabia after Iran-backed Houthis said they targeted the site. The attack comes a day after Saudi Arabia launched strikes in retaliation for the rebel group's attack on a Saudi vessel in the Red Sea. That clash happening during a rare apparent pause in fighting between the U.S. and Iran for the first time after 13 consecutive days of U.S. strikes. CNN's Nick Robertson is joining us right now. Nick, what more can you tell us about these strikes in Saudi Arabia and how that may impact the U.S. war with Iran?
Sure. Look, if these strikes continue, the Houthis striking Saudi shipping, the Saudis responding with strikes against the Houthis, and there have been a couple of those, one overnight, one earlier on today, and the Houthis then firing back at Saudi infrastructure, that really is going to potentially drive up the price of oil because it will stop Saudi oil getting out or make it much harder for Saudi oil to get out of the Red Sea through the Bab al-Mandab Straits. 6 or 7% of the world's oil comes out that way. Most of it goes to Asia. So what we've seen today is the Houthis saying that they targeted the main port city of Jizan. That is basically the biggest city that's close to where the Houthis are inside Yemen. So close they can hit it pretty readily. They say they targeted that. They say they targeted Yanbu, which is also a very important Saudi oil facility, but much further up the coast. Saudi alert system went off in Yanbu, but no reports of impact. But in Jizan, there's a refinery there. There's been sights of big clouds of smoke coming up from there. That is a very important city for the Saudis, Jizan. So at the moment, that part of the conflict in the Middle East is set to potentially expand and get worse, and to the point that the UN Secretary General today said that he was very alarmed by the situation there.
And then, Nick, what is President Trump and perhaps the Iranian leadership saying about possibly resuming any talks?
Yeah, there's been a sort of a backwards and forwards. Yes, we're ready for talks. No, we're not. They don't want it. They do want it. Yes, we do. But I think if we try to read what's happening on the ground rather than what people are saying, which is indicative, but what's happening on the ground is a sort of ground reality, if you will. So last night, there were no strikes. Then just in the last hour or so, the Qataris have told their shipping that they can go back to normal safety procedures, of course, but they can go back to normal Sunday. It seems to indicate that the Qataris sort of have a level of confidence in what happened last night. Clearly, this is Saturday. They're waiting to see before the shipping goes back to normal Sunday. But they seem to be indicating that if there is again tonight, no exchange of missiles between the United States and Iran, that might be indicative that a sort of ceasefire, no one's calling it that, but a sort of ceasefire is coming into play. Last night was quiet. That was exceptional. Nobody really spoke about that much. Indications are clearly the White House didn't want to escalate the situation, and clearly the Iranians didn't either. Is that going to hold through tonight? I think in diplomatic circles, those who are watching and are involved closely, they're really hoping tonight will be quiet, and we might be, caveat might be, entering a new phase.
All right. Fascinating. Nick Robertson, thank you so much. All right, let's continue this conversation now. With me is Aaron David Miller. He is a former State Department Middle East negotiator and is now senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Great to see you as always. So President Trump says he is weighing launching even bigger strikes on Iran. Iran says, I'm quoting now, it will not submit to American bullies. So what's your assessment here?
I mean, I think that's where we are, Fred. I mean, escalation, epic fury, 40 days of intense strikes, probably the largest deployment of American military power since the Second Iraq War, has not moved the Iranians, has not changed their calculations. And the administration, I think, for a while now has been in a box. The options are not good. Escalation, even severe escalation, is not going to bring the Iranians to the table, at least certainly not quickly. Extrication, simply walking away, is impossible, it seems to me, for this president. or probably for American national interests, which would leave the Straits a sort of ATM machine, and the Iranians want to make good on that as a cash cow. And then there's the prospects of negotiation. We could see resumption of talks, Fred, but the question is not just getting back to the table. The question is, what are they going to do at the table? And that I think is tough. Both sides believe time's on their side. Both sides believe they have the power to escalate. And both sides appear to believe that they can manage and tolerate the pain that's been inflicted. So unless that calculation changes, even if you got back to the table, you're not going to have a serious negotiation.
And then while that's happening or not happening, now you've got Saudi Arabia and the Houthis in Yemen exchanging attacks. So how much does this kind of stir the pot in this region?
I think it represents an expansion, right? I mean, I think Nick said 5-6% of global oil supply comes through Bab el-Mandeb, the Red Sea. Remember, this is an old story by now. The Houthis opened up in the wake of October 7 in an effort to support Palestinians in Gaza and to burnish their own credentials in Yemen. They literally almost shut down Red Sea trade. It's now, I think, 45 to 50%, forcing shippers and exporters to go around the Horn of Africa. That increases, complicates supply chains. If the Houthis decide to go after ports, Yanbu has already been attacked. The Saudis are exporting anywhere from 3 to 4 million barrels a day through Yanbu into the Red Sea. If that's what they do, then it seems to me price of oil, Brent crude, is going to go up. And there's really no end in sight here. Again, I think a rational outcome here is to have both Iran and the U.S. get back to the table. Then the question becomes, can you find a balance of interest on the one issue that seems to be the hardest right now to resolve? And that is what happens to the Straits of Hormuz. Is it free and unfettered like it was February 27, 28? Or are the Iranians going to impose new conditions? And I don't know whether the U.S. and Iranian interests right now can be reconciled on this key choke point.
And then this week, another kind of news involving Saudi Arabia, the U.S. signing a deal with that country to develop its domestic nuclear power program. After it was signed, Trump said normalized relations with Israel would be a condition of the agreement. What do you see happening here?
Fred, again, I'll say it. You can interpret it as a partisan comment. I worked for Democrats and Republicans, and I voted for Democrats and Republicans. What I saw play out in the last 48 hours is sort of a scene out of a Marx Brothers movie. A 3-month negotiation, even longer, with the Department of Energy led by Chris Wright and the Saudis come to a very detailed, haven't seen the text, but a very detailed understanding on any number of issues. And then the president decides, either because he wasn't briefed, it's hard to imagine that he wasn't aware of the issue of Israeli-Saudi normalization. Right now, he basically has undermined the very agreement he wanted to reach. And frankly, it put me down in the not altogether unhappy side of this, because there is no compelling reason, according to this agreement, that the Saudis should be able to enrich uranium, even under American auspices, and control their own fuel cycle. We're at war with a country who is essentially violating the International Atomic Energy Agency restrictions on the issue of enrichment. We do not need to lay the groundwork for another latent nuclear weapon state in the Middle East.
All right, more now on the war with Iran and a new front emerging in the region. New video shows smoke rising from an oil facility in Saudi Arabia after Iran-backed Houthis said they targeted the site. The attack comes a day after Saudi forces launched strikes in retaliation for the rebel group's attack on a Saudi vessel in the Red Sea. That clash happening during a rare apparent pause in fighting between the U.S. and Iran after 13 consecutive nights of attacks on Iran. CNN's Betsy Klein is joining us right now from the White House. Betsy, is the administration saying anything about this apparent pause in attacks on Iran or possible talks even potentially with Tehran?
Right, Frederica. After 13 consecutive nights of strikes on Iran, a relatively quiet night last night, and no reports of attacks between the U.S. and Iran. Now, this comes after U.S. intelligence agencies had recently assessed that these types of sort of limited strikes that the U.S. had been carrying out against Iran were unlikely to shift Iran's negotiating position. President Trump says that in his view, Iran isn't ready to make a deal yet. And there were some notable comments from White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt to the Wall Street Journal earlier this week. She said that the U.S. will continue to hit Iran until they come to the table in what President Trump deems a meaningful way. So we are waiting to see now whether that is indeed the case here. But President Trump offering some insight into his mindset yesterday. Listen.
Look, we're talking to them right now. I think they're getting more and more serious as the days go by, for maybe the obvious reason. But we are talking to them right now. Look, there are two ways. I consider that the smarter way, but the other is probably the easier way, doing what we're doing. And we can take that to a much higher level if we want to. You know, we're prepared to do that, as you know. We're locked and loaded.
Now, as we are trying to ascertain what to make of this pause in strikes, a senior U.S. official tells me that President Trump has always been clear that his preference is diplomacy, but he has shown Iran what will happen if they fail to come to the table in a serious way. Frederica.
Okay, and Betsy, the Pentagon still hasn't updated the website that tracks casualties of war. What more are you learning?
Well, at issue here is a website called the Defense Casualty Analysis System that tracks those casualties during a conflict. And the New York Times first noticed this, and they got conflicting answers as to why that had been changed from 18 deaths to 14 deaths this week. 3 military officials had told them that there had been some sensitive discussions about whether to include those 4 fallen U.S. service members who died last weekend in the count, because that had come after President Trump signed that ceasefire deal that ultimately, as we know, had fallen apart. But a Pentagon spokesperson saying in a statement that this was a temporary data disruption that would be resolved. Of course, that was on Thursday. It is now Saturday. I checked just moments before I came on the air. The count is still 14.
All right, we're following new developments in the Middle East, where Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen say they attacked an oil facility in Saudi Arabia. The two sides have exchanged multiple strikes in recent days, raising concerns that a new front has opened up in the war. With us now is Brett Bruen. He is a former National Security Council and State Department official in the Obama White House, and he's now CEO of a public affairs company, Global Situation Room. Great to see you.
Good to be with you, Fred.
So are these strikes between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis now creating among the greatest risks for regional escalation of this conflict?
Yeah, Fred, you know, the really interesting dynamic here is throughout the first 5 months of the war, Trump essentially viewed this as, you know, he and Netanyahu versus the regime in Tehran. And yet what is starting to unfold is that there are considerable costs, consequences for other countries. And, you know, if I'm sitting in Saudi Arabia, my frustration level is reaching a peak point. I think it's part of the reason, quite frankly, that that supposed nuclear enrichment deal was reached earlier the week, and then Trump tried to change the terms of it. You know, Trump and, quite frankly, American taxpayers are going to be on the hook for a lot of both the reconstruction of the region, as well as just, you know, obviously this thing continues to spiral out of control, and we'll have to see where it goes.
And now, for the first time in about 2 weeks, there were no reported strikes between the U.S. and Iran overnight. Could a pause in fighting be an opening for diplomacy right now, or is this a more ominous sign in your view?
It could be. And look, sometimes in these diplomatic negotiations, you want, as a sign of good faith, to say, we will pause for a moment. And that ensures that negotiators in Tehran can gain some level of confidence, perhaps get a deal across the line. But Fred, we've already seen a deal cross the line, and it didn't hold. And I think that has been the real challenge for Trump, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, is how do I get something that is not just strong, but sustainable. And at this moment, and Trump last night was saying, I want all of my demands met. And that just isn't a realistic starting point. And he's obviously been a very mercurial figure, often changing terms, including, as I mentioned, with a deal that he struck with the Saudis.
President Trump, he was asked last night, if an exit strategy with Iran is afoot. Take a listen to what he said.
There's a military exit where we just keep going just the way we are, and we can even make it a heavier dose, and it's knocking out everything they have. Or there's a smarter strategy, and that's you make a deal, and they want to make a deal. I just don't think they're ready yet.
So what do you think? Is it Iran isn't ready, or as some Iranian leadership said recently, that it will not be bullied by the U.S.? So what is happening here?
Well, let me interpret what Trump was saying. He essentially is implying that the U.S. will just continue to bludgeon Iran. And we've seen this show just recently in the case of Gaza. I do not think that the United States of America wants to be engaged in a conflict in which we are attacking not just civilian infrastructure, as already happened in the last couple of weeks, but civilians. And Fred, it is important that we level set with what Trump is threatening here. You cannot simply bomb your way to a negotiated deal. And that is where I think Americans, and certainly those in Congress, need to start speaking up and reminding that, one, we have laws, and those laws, including in war, have to be followed. But also we have values and morals. And at the end of the day, this is just going to generate more support for Tehran amongst other countries, amongst other groups. And that's worrying from a security standpoint.
Okay. And a couple times in this conversation, you've brought up Saudi Arabia, and that deal, the U.S. Nuclear deal or arrangement being made with Saudi Arabia. And I'm wondering, is it your feeling that this comes out of an appeasement, so to speak, but at the same time, then the president, the next day after it was revealed publicly, put a condition in place. So do you see this as a viable path for Saudi Arabia and the U.S. in this arrangement of nuclear enrichment, or is there something else going on here?
Well, there is no doubt, Fred, that the regional allies are sending messages to Washington that their economies have been badly hit. There is no Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, their big plan for economic growth, with the vision of missiles on the horizon. And so the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, the Omanis are frantically calling Washington and saying, you are going to owe us for these. We may not necessarily be seeing that in the public space, but the damage to their economies is so great. And the future prospects, even if we get to a ceasefire or a peace deal, this war has created instability. It's created concern in the Gulf, and that is coming with a considerable.
With what appears to be a pause in U.S. attacks against Iran, the U.S. military did not announce it was launching strikes on Friday. This is after pummeling Iran for 13 straight nights. And we're also not getting any reports of Iranian attacks on U.S. allies in Bahrain, Jordan, or Kuwait overnight. Now, all of this comes after President Trump met with top advisors and cabinet officials to discuss a potential escalation of the war. That's according to a source. The president says the U.S. is still actively negotiating with Iran after their ceasefire agreement crumbled earlier this month. But he also suggested U.S. forces could press on with their campaign and even expand it.
There's a military exit where we just keep going just the way we are, and we can even make it a heavier dose, and it's knocking out everything they have. Or there's a smarter strategy, and that's you make a deal, and they want to make a deal. I just don't think they're ready yet.
I want to bring in now Leila Gargazo. She is joining us live from London. So we're hearing from our reporters in the White House, Leila, that President Trump is weighing the possibility of a massive attack. I mean, what could that mean after nearly 2 weeks of punishing airstrikes?
Yeah, so it could mean a range of things. He's said over the last 2 weeks that he could hit civilian infrastructure like bridges or desalination plants. He's also toyed with the idea of hitting Mount Kolang, or as people call it, Pickaxe Mountain, which is part of the Natanz facility. So there could be quite a lot of different options here. The U.S. generally over the last 2 weeks has been working to degrade Iran's military capability and loosen its control over the Strait of Hormuz. So much of those strikes that we've seen in these 14 days have really been in that stretch along the southern area of Iran, the defensive arch. He could widen that out, go back to hitting places like Tehran and really focusing again on the capital. So there's a lot to work with, I guess, in terms of strike targets. That being said, he's also had conflicting statements where he said that, you know, they could be talking, the Iranians are talking, he's open to the idea of diplomatic negotiations. So it's unclear what next steps he's going to take. Now, a lot of the analysts and experts that I've been speaking to over the last 2 weeks have said that if the U.S. is looking to have Iran capitulate via more airstrikes and an expanded campaign, that's very unlikely to happen. And the Iranians themselves have said that. They've said that if the U.S. escalates, they're going to escalate in kind. They're not going to sit and negotiate, and they're not going to move those red lines around things like their nuclear program, which is what President Trump says he wants curbed. So it's unclear what a actual expansion of the mission for the U.S. is going to really do. It's not going to necessarily bring Iran back to the table. And one of the things to remember here is that Iran has a very high pain threshold when it comes to these strikes and even things like an economic blockade. So they can go quite a long time with this kind of conflict before it really starts changing their behavior. And it's unclear if the U.S. is going to want to commit to a much broader war and campaign. Salma.
Well, so far this morning, Iranian media has not reported any strikes inside the country as the U.S. conflict with Iran continues. Now, CENTCOM also did not report any military action yesterday. That's after the U.S. pounded Iran with strikes for nearly 2 weeks straight. President Trump did say he thinks Iran is getting more serious in talks and try to end the war. Let's discuss with Maryland Congresswoman Sarah Elfreth. Congresswoman, thank you for being with me. These, first night of breaks after 13 consecutive nights of attacks. The president is reportedly considering an escalation in strikes. What do you make of these strikes, and do you think they are persuasive? The president seems to think so.
Oh, well, the president claims to be the best deal maker that I think ever was in the White House or in the world. And we're seeing that that's just not true. We're 150 days into this conflict. We've lost 19 service members. Another 400 have been injured. Secretary Hegseth just told the Congress that he estimates this this war has cost $37 billion in taxpayer money. And there's still no end in sight. The president seems to be warmongering via tweet instead of having a thoughtful strategy here. I don't think he had a goal to begin with when he got us into this war, and he certainly doesn't have any way to get us out of it right now. It's, I'm watching it just like you are every single day. There is a new escalation, a new twist to this war, and frankly, the American people are fed up.
Well, the president says that the Iranians are getting more serious about talks. Let me play specifically what the president said from the Oval.
Have you made a decision about the major strikes that you were referring to? Okay. Should we expect to see major strikes?
Look, we're talking to them right now. I think they're getting more and more serious as the days go by, for maybe the obvious reason. But we are talking to them right now. Look, there are two ways. I consider that the smarter way, but the other is probably the easier way, doing what we're doing. And we can take that to a much higher level if we want to. We're prepared to do that, as you know. We're locked and loaded.
Locked and loaded, and they're getting more serious. What do you believe is the viability of talks at this point? I mean, there was the ceasefire, the memorandum of understanding that was violated or kind of fell apart within days. What about now?
Honestly, I don't think the president knows how to get out of this. And he's just talking out of both sides of his mouth. To your point, he claimed we had a ceasefire. He was the one who violated it. There is no strategy. There is no plan. I didn't feel like there was a strategy to begin with when we got into this war. We don't know where we are in the process of the war. Congress and my committee, the Armed Services Committee, has not been given an exit strategy. Again, we just see, like you do every single day in the news, more service members in harm's way, more taxpayer money being spent with no end in sight, and just a continued escalation of this conflict for the entire region. And it's not just the U.S. versus Iran at this point. You're seeing Iran bombing other folks in the region, and the escalation of this should be scary to every single American watching it at home, just like we are. Now, the Congress has passed, you probably saw, 2 war powers resolutions. We had 4 Republicans join us, recognizing that we need to reassert our constitutional authority when it comes to declaring war, providing a check on the president. He seems to not care or think that they are at all relevant to his actions here, but the American people are pretty loud and clear that this needs to end. And I'm not sure who he is listening to, certainly not the people, Congress, or even his advisors.
The president, after Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said that Russia and China are enabling Iran, said that he doesn't believe that Xi and Putin are arming Iran. Here's what he said.
I will tell you that President Xi said he will not partake, and President Putin said the same thing. I think, I trust them. I don't think they'd want to have me disappointed.
He doesn't think they want to have him disappointed. What do you think about the degree to which, and there may be a little daylight between what we heard from Hegseth and what the president said intentionally, but how China and Russia are involved with Iran in this war?
It's my understanding that China has helped the Iranians at least with targeting of U.S. assets, which, maybe is not arming Iran, but it's certainly enabling and helping to put U.S. service members in harm's way. So the president might believe that he is a friend in China here. I don't believe that's true. And again, he has not come to the Congress to justify any of this war. He's not come to, has not come to the American people to justify this war. I don't know what he believes, but he's not listening to, I think, the smarter people on this issue, and it's only putting Americans in harm's way.
I got a wrap for the control room, but I want to ask you one more about what we've been reporting this morning about the uncorrected number of deaths from the Department of Defense. This morning, it's at 14, despite the 4 service members killed last weekend, that the number should be at 18. Some injuries have been removed as well. The Department of Defense says it's a data disruption. What do you say about this change in the number of deaths attributed to this war?
I think it's an odd time to have a data disruption. I think since the president has re-escalated things and we've lost more service members and we've lost more, if more service members have been injured, he owes the American people transparency and accountability. And the fact that the Department of Defense can't keep its website up to date, it's obfuscation at the very least, but it is more of a trend of this president obfuscating what is happening in this region and frankly covering it up because he knows that it is a deeply, deeply unpopular war with the American people.
What are you seeing? Saudi striking Houthis in Yemen. What does this mean for the war?
Yeah, I mean, this marks quite an interesting escalation here, Alex, because I'm just looking at the Saudi Civil Defense X posts, and they basically had put out another announcement and warning for the Yanbu Governorate. And Yanbu port is super important because it's this release valve for the east-west pipeline carrying crucial oil that goes through the Bab al-Mandab Strait. And now they say the threat has been eliminated. A little earlier this morning, about an hour ago, they said there was a threat in Jizan, which is also very important because it has a lot of downstream oil products that are created there. That threat, again, eliminated. But just to your point around these vessels that have been struck in in the Red Sea. Look, the Houthis had put up this blockade of any vessel that is related to Saudi Arabia, saying that they will not be able to cross the Bab al-Mandab Strait. This is now the third vessel that was struck, according to the reports that we've been reading. And then the Saudi-led coalition striking Hodeidah port, specific targets there. The Houthis have responded saying they mark this as an escalation for escalation. Now, keeping in mind, Saudi Arabia and the Houthis had signed a truce in 2022. This would mark the very first time that that truce now is being, is majorly under threat. So we know that there's sort of war of words that from both sides, generally speaking, from the United States and Iran. But now the Saudi attacks, specifically in Yemen, really mark sort of an interesting point that we're seeing going into this weekend.
Meanwhile, Iran has been targeting the region often. How are leaders there responding?
So, I mean, with, lots of condemnation that we've been seeing and messaging of, we have to see a point of de-escalation. And the last 13 days have been very interesting because you've had 13 consecutive nights of strikes. It seems that CENTCOM has not embarked on any strikes against Iran overnight. So that would mark a significant pause here. But just speaking to what President Trump has been reiterating this week, that they're planning and thinking about striking Iran in a very big way. And Iran consistently saying it's going to be an eye for an eye. That is their doctrine. And Marco Rubio saying, look, it's going to be a head for an eye. We're waiting to see how this transpires. But when I look at some of the strikes specifically, just over the last few days, it's been Kuwait, Jordan, as well as Bahrain that have really been the focal points. But over the last 13 days, it's included Oman, Qatar as well. We've seen strikes in Syria as well as Iraq. There's been major concern in the region that this could widen, become a larger war where a lot more sort of transpires. The things that are on the table, and a lot of military analysts are talking about this, could we see a ground invasion? President Trump was talking about the Pickaxe Mountain, Kohe Kolang, which is very close to the nuclear facility of Natanz. Is that going to be a target? We've consistently seen targets against some of those port cities in Iran, and the region is just holding its breath, waiting to see what happens next. Because if there is more escalation, if there isn't sort of a diplomatic off-ramp, what does this mean for the wider region? And Alex, importantly, what does it mean for the Strait of Hormuz? What does it mean for Bab al-Mandab Strait, where a new front has clearly opened up again? Also, just I want to mention that any Saudi ships are actually under a blockade, but some Chinese-owned vessels that have come from Saudi ports have been able to negotiate with the Houthis in terms of transiting. So maritime officials are watching this very closely, but there is a threat. It is worrying, and this is going to affect traffic all around sort of the region. And importantly, it's going to spill over into the global economy.
Welcome. We begin with what appears to be a pause in U.S. attacks against Iran. The U.S. military did not announce it was launching strikes on Friday after pummeling Iran for 13 straight nights. This all comes after President Trump met with top advisors and cabinet officials to discuss a potential escalation of the war. That is according to a source. The president says the U.S. is still actively negotiating with Iran after their ceasefire agreement crumbled earlier this month. But he also suggested U.S. forces could press on with their campaign and even expand it. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia has unleashed strikes on what it described as Houthi targets in Yemen. The Saudi military says it was a proportionate response after another Saudi ship was attacked by Yemen's Iran-backed Houthis in the Red Sea. Let's bring in CNN's Leila Garagozlu, live from London. It's good to see you. We may finally be seeing a shift around talks, but what's the latest?
Yeah, so there's actually quite a lot of conflicting messaging that we've been hearing over the last nearly 2 weeks, and especially overnight. You know, President Trump has gone back and forth saying, we're open to talks, we are talking, we want to strike harder. So it's very difficult to read the tea leaves in this situation because the president is a bit unpredictable when it comes to this. Now, just last night, he said that the Iranians were actually talking. Take a listen.
And by the way, they are talking to us right now. They'd love to make a deal. I don't think they're ready to. I don't think it's time yet, but I'm willing to listen. But they cannot have a nuclear weapon. We don't want to see Washington, D.C., or any of our cities, or Israel, or frankly, the Middle East, destroyed with a nuclear weapon, because I know the power of nuclear weapons. I see it. I get to see it. We're not going to let that happen.
So the real issue here is that the Iranians have not said that they are talking. They've actually been quite clear that they're open to negotiations, but they're not in the midst of talking. And part of that really comes down to the fact that they're not really seeing an element of trust with the American delegation and President Trump when it comes to any sort of negotiations. They don't believe that they can actually get a deal that leads them to that moment of peace, right? And they don't want a no war, no peace limbo situation once again. That's basically what we saw in that lead up to the MOU. And then, as you know, the MOU was incredibly vague, very difficult to implement. The Iranians don't want that again. Any sort of deal, they say they want to have it be something that achieves lasting peace. Now, the other element that I think is interesting to look at when it comes to President Trump's comments is that he continuously shifts the goals of this war. And this is another thing that the Iranians take issue with. And a number of analysts that I've spoken to over the course of the last few months have said time and time again that that's going to be what makes it very difficult to get some sort of deal or find an off-ramp, because the goals of the war from the U.S. perspective keep shifting, whether it's Iran's nuclear program or the Strait of Hormuz. It makes it a very difficult situation to negotiate around.
And at the same time as that, how significant is Saudi Arabia's decision to strike the Houthis?
Yeah, so this is quite significant. We've seen a truce in place between the Houthis in Yemen and Saudi Arabia since about 2022, and that was quite a big deal, really drawing down a years-long conflict. Now we're seeing that flare up again, and it really means that we might see another front to this war off the back of the U.S.-Iran, which once again leads to these concerns of an expansion and escalation throughout the broader region. So we're going to have to watch what happens between Saudi and Yemen very, very closely. If we see things really kick off there, again, it's going to have this massive impact on the region and these trade routes like the Bab el-Mandeb and the broader Red Sea.
Pay up. That's what Trump is demanding of Iran as it launches new strikes tonight. In a post Trump just put out, he said, quote, "Please let this statement serve to represent, until further notice, that from this point forth, any and all damages done to ships, cargo, or anything related thereto will be paid for by Iranian money that the United States has in its possession and controls. These damages may be very substantial, but nevertheless, this is the fair and equitable thing to do." Now, it's worth noting that this is the same man who said he was going to give Iran its money back as part of the MOU, right? That was the whole thing. He was giving them this money back. He actually said this.
It's not our money, it's their money, and we froze it. At a certain point in time.
It's not our money, it's their money. Those are his words. Now, Trump's claim about where the money is going to come comes after he has just leveled another massive threat, telling Axios, quote, "I am considering a massive attack, bigger than ever before. I am close to making a decision. We're all set for it." Yeah, well, the rhetoric out there is causing a lot of problems, real world problems for Americans and around the world. I mean, for the first time since May today, on the back of comments like that, oil prices are back above $100 a barrel. And relief, even if Trump ends the war soon, as he said he's going to do for almost 5 months, well, it's not going down anytime soon, even though he's promised it will.
When this is over, oil is going to drop like a rock.
When this war is over, oil is going to drop. When the war is over, gas will fall down at levels that you've never seen before.
The gas will go down. As soon as the war's over, it'll drop like a rock.
Well, here's the thing. You got to look at what the markets are telling you right now. If you look at Brent oil futures, okay, which is you're looking out, traders trade on this a long time in the future. Okay, we're going out here to April 2032. You can see before we get back below $70 a barrel, which is where prices were before the war. And they're obviously expecting the war to end really soon. Okay, that's why you see the drop there. But it doesn't go back to where it was for years. And it's not just the oil market sounding an alarm. The 10-year U.S. Treasury yield, which is really what is used as the benchmark for credit card debt, student loans, mortgages, all of those interest rates are linked to that. It's up to 4.7%. That is the highest level since Trump was inaugurated. So borrowing costs are going up, gas prices are going up. It's real pain. It's tangible. And on Capitol Hill, Trump suffering a bipartisan hit today. Republicans joining Democrats to pass a resolution for the second time to check Trump's war powers. Now, it's essentially symbolic, but the fact that they're willing to put votes on the line is a public rejection of Trump's war. And tonight, his approach here could be pushing the U.S. into a wider war. According to the Wall Street Journal, American medics have now arrived at the key medical center in Germany, which is where U.S. troops injured in Trump's war are being treated. Axios is reporting a B-1 bomber was used to attack Iran for the first time since combat resumed, and the U.S. is planning to send more F-16 and F-35 fighter jets into the region. Now, of course, the surge doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a major, massive attack, as Trump says. Doesn't mean it's inevitable. But when you put all that money and all that material in place, sometimes things have a life of their own, despite what Trump has continued to claim on all of this ever since the war started.
Right from the beginning, we projected 4 to 5 weeks.
The U.S. will be gone or done with the war in 2
I think
weeks?
we're 2 or 3 weeks. Yeah. We were in there for 2 months. And you know what? We're going to have victory very shortly. I thought it would take 4 to 6 weeks, and I was right. We'll have that over with soon. It'll be over with soon.
It's 5 months and counting. Kristen Holmes is out front live outside the White House. And Kristen, all of this together, when you see what's happening, if you look at data point after data point, right, putting planes in place and medics, and then Trump's rhetoric saying possibly the most massive strike since the war began. What are you hearing about where his head is tonight, and frankly, how quickly he keeps changing his mind?
Well, Erin, I mean, as you said, it's 5 months and counting, and the end is not anywhere in sight. First of all, you have Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying things like Iran is begging to get to the table, something we've heard from President Trump, too. But then President Trump today saying he doesn't think Iran is ready for a deal, even going further than that, saying they need more of the same. Well, more of the same likely is referring to the fact that we've had 12 consecutive nights of bombings in Iran, but are reporting today that the CIA and the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, have recently assessed that this kind of bombing that the U.S. is doing every single night is unlikely to move Iran's negotiating position. So what exactly is it that President Trump is trying to do? And we've heard this kind of rhetoric from him before. Now, when we've talked to U.S. officials, they have said that Trump has yet to sign off on the most aggressive military action. So is what he's trying to do get Iranians back to the negotiating table? It's really unclear at this point. But as you noted, he is making all of the moves, setting up for a potential escalation in military operation. But what does that do for this war in Iran? What does that do for the American people? I can tell you from every conversation that I have with the White House, with White House officials, U.S. officials, anyone close to President Trump, they do not want to be talking about this war. They do not want to be engaging in this war. They would take a ceasefire now if they could just get a ceasefire, hope for the prices to kind of level or at least go down a little bit, and then they could move on to talking about things like the economy. That's obviously not going to happen if President Trump escalates this. So is he willing to escalate this and potentially even put boots on the ground? We just aren't clear right now what the strategy is, and we're getting nothing from President Trump's orbit as to what he's going to do to break this impasse between Iran and the United States that at this point seems like it's just going to continue.
Yeah. All right, Kristen, thank you very much. And of course, just so much confusion on strategy and also what the end goal even is, what they actually want. Christoph Kettle is here with the New York Times. Seth Jones is also here with me. And I know both of you have so much new information. So, Seth, can I just start with you? I know you've been speaking to senior U.S. officials. Are we about to see a massive escalation here, the bigger strikes, bigger action than since the war began?
Well, Erin, only one person knows the answer to that, and that is President Trump right now. I will tell you what the military has given him is options. They've given him options if he wants to open up the strait. This will be risky. They've given him air options. They've given him air plus naval options, so to put in naval vessels, including potentially destroyers through the strait to bring in tankers and others, and then air plus naval plus ground options. So the president does have options if he wants to forcibly open up the strait. The Iran war gets a second front. The president says he's weighing a massive new attack as U.S. intelligence assesses the current bombing campaign is unlikely to get Iran to give in. John King here, in for Anderson. There's all that tonight, and for the 13th straight evening, more U.S. airstrikes. No sign yet they differ greatly from the first 12, but earlier today, the president telling Axios, quote, "I am considering a massive attack, bigger than ever before. I'm close to making a decision. We are all set for it." The president also claimed that Tehran wants to negotiate, but in his words, quote, "They haven't received enough pain yet." Here's how he put it a short time later.
We're doing very well against the Islamic Republic of Iran. We're doing extremely well. They would like to do something, but I say they're not ready yet. They need more of the same. They're not ready yet.
Clearly, though, the president's remarks to Axios suggest that more of the same, as he put it, has not been enough, and brand new CNN reporting certainly backs that up. Two sources familiar with the matter telling us both the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency have recently assessed that the current bombing campaign is unlikely to force Iran and its leadership to shift its negotiating position. That said, the talk is certainly getting tougher. Here's Secretary of State Rubio.
Do you rule out striking civilian?
I think I saw, guys, I saw Arachi, their foreign minister, who the other day say or something about their policies, an eye for an eye. The president's policy is a head for an eye. I mean, honestly, that's what it's going to be.
And late today, the president added a wrinkle to that, posting, quote, "Any and all damages done to ships, cargo, or anything related thereto will be paid for by Iranian money that the United States has in its possession and controls." It's unclear whether those tougher words will budge Tehran, which gained leverage of its own last night in the form of a second front, namely in the Bab al-Mandeb. That's the choke point. You see it on the map at the mouth of the Red Sea. You see traffic flowing through it now, but last night, Iranian-backed Houthi fighters hit 2 Saudi oil tankers attempting passage, and that in turn, predictable I guess, sent oil prices surging back above the $100 a barrel mark. Gas prices rising as well today. You see it there hitting $4.09 a gallon, up 15 cents from just a week ago. And on Capitol Hill, a House and a Senate split on whether to try to limit the war. House Democrats, joined by 4 Republicans, passed a non-binding war powers resolution. Senate Republicans, joined by Democrat John Fetterman, blocked similar legislation. We begin tonight with our CNN senior White House correspondent, Kristen Holmes. Kristen, I want to start. There's been a revision at the Pentagon, the website, about the fatalities. Can you explain that?
Well, we're still learning more details here. So on Wednesday, the Pentagon had reported these casualties on the website and said what we have been reporting and know to be true, that there were 18 American service members who have been killed since the start of the war. But by Thursday, the Department of Defense had changed that number to 14, so from 18 to 14. Now, according to the New York Times, one of the reasons behind the change was because the administration was not looking at these 4 service members as being part of the conflict. Again, this is from the New York Times reporting, because their deaths occurred after President Trump had announced this ceasefire. But on the other side, we have heard, and again, this has also only been a response to the New York Times. We have reached out on our own, but have not heard from the acting press secretary, who attributed the change instead to temporary data disruptions on the website and suggested that they would be quickly fixed. Now, of course, we're going to monitor to see how quickly they are fixed. And John, I do want to note here, we have been keeping our own tally, and 18 is the number that we have been citing regularly since this last weekend after the passing of those 4 additional service members. So it is unclear why this change happened, but of course we are trying to get to the bottom of it.
Well, let's get to the president's strategy here. Number one, tougher words, a massive strike. We have the will to do it. We have the material to do it. And then the tough words from the president talking about if there's any damage to ships or cargoes paid for out of the Iranian funds that the United States has in escrow. We've heard a lot from the president in the last 4.5 months, and sometimes you get the follow through and sometimes you don't. Connect those and tell us what's the big shift, if one, in White House strategy.
Right now, there is no apparent White House strategy. You had Secretary Marco Rubio saying that Iran is begging to come to the table. Then you have President Trump today saying they're not ready to make a deal. They're not ready to come to the table. Instead, they need more of the same. Well, at the same time, U.S. intelligence is saying in their recent assessments that this more of the same, this bombing every night, is not going to change the Iranian stance on negotiations, or is unlikely to do so. So what is the president going to do? Well, we know and we have reported over and over and over again, the president has been looking for some kind of diplomatic off-ramp. It is just seeming less and less likely. So now there is a decision to make. How far does the president want to go? There is a contingency of people around him, particularly in the political space, who say that if the President Trump goes any further than this, if he talks about putting boots on the ground or does some kind of explosive military action, there is a chance he is completely giving away the midterms here. This is looming over everything that he is doing politically. There's also still the chance that President Trump tries to take this in a different direction, but it's really unclear because the options are so limited, John. We are looking at more strikes, more of the same. Doesn't seem to be moving the needle. So what will move the needle? We still don't know, and we don't know what President Trump is willing to do, but U.S. officials have continued to tell us that he has not signed off on the most aggressive military action yet, meaning likely he is still looking for any kind of off-ramp here.
Kristen Holmes at the White House. Thank you so much. Let's continue the conversation now. Joining me, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, Dana Stroll, and retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. Colonel, if my memory is correct, 25, 26 years in Air Force intelligence. When the DIA and the Defense Department says the current bombing campaign is unlikely to bring the Iranians to the table in a way that is conducive to a deal, and you have the president saying he's ready to up the ante here, what happens next?
Yeah, John, great question. And yeah, after 26 years of experience in Air Force intelligence, this is a bit of an unusual area. But when it comes to the target set that you have in question here, what you're really looking at is the realization that the things that they've done so far in terms of striking targets in Iran while causing a lot of damage have not really changed Iran's war aims or the trajectory of Iran's military moves. And, you know, they talk about decimating the Iranian military. The problem is that Iran basically works with an asymmetric force. And what that means is that they're using means other than conventional military force to achieve their goals. So what we're seeing is the fact that the Iranians can still maintain control over the Strait of Hormuz. That, for the moment at least, has not changed. We're also seeing that Iran has the capability to launch long-range missiles and drones. That has not changed, and that is really one of the key things. These two areas are areas that should have been altered by a campaign that is really couched on what the other side is doing. The problem is that we're fighting a war that's more conventional. They're fighting a war where they've been able to hide a lot of their weapon systems and then brought them out into the open.
And so, Dana, it brings a pretty profound moment and a profound question. You see all the words from the president, an escalation in his words. You see more U.S. military assets moving into the region, which would give him the capabilities, I gather, to back those words up. Some say, oh, it's just to try to convince the Iranians it's time to talk more seriously. Others say the president wouldn't send them if he's not planning to use them. How do you see it?
Well, we've seen this over and over from the Trump administration. When there's a U.S. military buildup in the region, Trump tends to order those assets to be used. We saw it last year before the 12-day war. It looked like he was using that military buildup to signal to the Iranians he was really serious, threatening that use of force to compel them to come back to the negotiating table and make commitments on their nuclear program. That didn't happen, and a 12-day war started. And the same thing this year. There was another military buildup starting in January all the way through February, at the same time that there was a U.S. negotiating team meeting with the Iranians in Geneva. And before those negotiations played out, the war started. The U.S. started striking Iran together with Israel. So number one, I think the Iranians look at this buildup, and at this point, it's reasonable to expect that once Trump builds up, he's boxed himself in and he's most likely going to escalate. And the challenge here is that we have no articulation from the Trump administration as to what those escalated strikes or that escalated strategy is actually going to deliver in terms of achievable objectives. Is this about opening the Strait of Hormuz? Is it about getting Iranian commitments on the nuclear program? We haven't heard that articulation, and so this looks like a means without an end.
And Colonel, as this plays out, you have a second front, at least at the moment. We saw it yesterday, the Houthis getting involved in attacking tankers in the Red Sea. The theater has been Iran and the areas in the Straits of Hormuz. From a capability standpoint, does the U.S. get spread too thin here? Does the United States need additional assets in any particular way if that stays a persistent two-front effort?
Yeah, John, it depends on exactly what the goals are when it comes to Yemen and the Houthis and the opening the Bab el-Mandeb Strait there. So the question then is, if the idea is to go in and decimate the Houthis, we would need more forces to do that. If it is just to keep things open on a more or less temporary basis, we could probably do it with the forces that are already in the Middle East, but it would be a precarious move because things can change very quickly, and the Houthis could probably come in and close the Bab el-Mandeb again if they wanted to.
News is the New York Times is reporting that Iran rejected a ceasefire proposal from President Trump. According to the Times, it was the Iraqi prime minister who personally carried the offer directly to the Iranians in Tehran. It comes as U.S. forces are bombarding Iranian targets for a 13th straight night, and once again runs counter to the president's description of the war.
We're doing very well against the Islamic Republic of Iran. We're doing extremely well. They would like to do something, but I say they're not ready yet. They need more of the same.
More of the same, which is not the same thing he's been saying repeatedly for months now.
We've won. Let me tell you, we've won. I mean, I view it as very close to over. We are likewise winning big in Iran. We have many ways we can win, but we've already won militarily.
In fact, sources say even the president's own experts have concluded more of the same is unlikely to shift Iran's negotiating position in any significant way. According to two U.S. officials familiar with those intelligence assessments, both the CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, recently determined that the kind of bombing campaign will not be enough to bring an end to the war, which has gone on far longer than the president boldly promised when it began.
We projected 4 to 5 weeks, but we have capability to go far longer than that.
Are you thinking this week it will be over?
No,
Are you talking
but soon.
about days?
I think soon.
Okay, and with respect
Very
to...
soon. Look, and I don't think it's going to be long.
Can we wrap this war up this week?
Yeah, sure. Good.
Will we?
I don't think so, but it'll be soon. Won't be long.
It would take approximately 4 to 6 weeks to achieve this critical mission.
So we estimate it would take approximately 4 to 6 weeks to achieve our mission. 26 days in, we're really a lot ahead of schedule.
4 to 6 weeks estimated timeline for Operation Epic Fury.
You know, he said 4 to 6 weeks.
Here we are months later, and instead the war appears headed toward yet another escalation, driving oil prices back above $100 a barrel for the first time in 2 months, as President Trump tells our colleague Barak Ravid of Axios that he is, quote, considering a massive attack bigger than ever before. I am close to making a decision. We are all set for it, end quote. All set for the biggest attack yet, but is the U.S. public all set? Polling overwhelmingly shows otherwise, as the Secretary of State laid out an ominous new Trump doctrine.
The president's policy is a head for an eye. I mean, honestly, that's what it's going to be. I mean, they will pay a very heavy price for the things they're doing. They're already paying a very heavy price.
A head for an eye instead of an eye for an eye. My lead sources are CNN Global Affairs analyst and former Middle East and North Africa coordinator for the National Security Council, Brett McGurk, as well as CNN National Security Analyst, former Deputy Director of National Intelligence, Beth Sanner. Good to have you both here. So you read the Times story here. The Iraqi leader goes directly to Tehran, delivering a peace proposal, ceasefire proposal from the president. Iran says no. Brett McGurk, does that indicate to you that Iranians, in fact, are in no rush to reach a ceasefire and don't feel this enormous military pressure?
You know, Jim, I come back. I mean, given everything going on, I think we have to keep. We have Americans. We're at war. We have Americans over Iran tonight, men and women in combat.
Dramatic escalation could be right around the corner in Iran. President Trump tells Axios that he's considering a, quote, massive attack against Iran, one bigger than ever before, and he's close to making that decision now. He says Iran wants to negotiate, but Trump doesn't want to make a deal. He says, quote, they haven't received enough pain yet. However, the New York Times is also reporting tonight that Iran has rejected a ceasefire proposal from Trump, one that was presented to them by the Iraqi foreign prime minister. Now, sources tell CNN that U.S. intelligence agencies say the bombing that the U.S. is currently carrying out is unlikely to shift Iran's negotiating position. And according to Marco Rubio, Trump is done with a proportional response.
Do you rule out striking civilian?
I think I saw, guys, I saw Arachi, their foreign minister, who the other day say or something about their policies, an eye for an eye. The president's policy is a head for an eye. I mean, honestly, that's what it's going to be.
It all comes as the House narrowly voted to limit Trump's war powers in Iran, but a similar measure was rejected in the Senate. And a new Fox News poll shows that Trump's and the party's support is waning. Trump is significantly underwater when it comes to his handling of his job, as well as inflation, the economy, Iran, even immigration. With the midterms just over 3 months away, some are already sounding the alarm.
The truth is there's not much good news for Republicans in this whole poll we did. Underwater on the economy, as you showed, underwater on affordability. Those two issues are front and center for sure. And everywhere you look, Republicans are down.
Now, before we open it up to the table here, I want to invite you at home to join the debate. Head to cnn.com/Abby. You can weigh in there. We'll get to some of your comments throughout the show. Congressman Khanna, just for starters, when you hear the president talking tough, as he has been, frankly, for the last several months in this conflict, and then also sending Iran a proposal for a ceasefire that they then summarily reject, what does it tell you about what the strategy is here?
There is no strategy. I'm for results. We just voted to, again, stop the war in Iran this morning in the House. But what has the president achieved? He's driven gas prices up. He's driven food prices up. The enriched uranium is still in Iran. They have a more extreme regime because the sun isn't even saying what Khamenei did, which was we won't develop nuclear weapons. The IRGC is strong.
All right, new reporting from Barak Ravid of Axios this morning that the U.S. is deploying the B-1 bomber in the war with Iran. That reporting that the U.S. is using the bomber to strike Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps targets in a major escalation of the conflict there. CNN political and global affairs analyst Barak Ravid joining us now behind all of this reporting. Give us some sense of what kind of escalation this is and where we are right now in this war that just seems to be escalating without the other end of it, which is trying to negotiate their way out of it.
Well, first, I think when it comes to the B-1 bomber mission, I think what we see here is that the U.S. military is deploying more and more assets to the region in an effort to increase the strikes on Iran, to get it to concede to the U.S. demands, both in the Strait of Hormuz, which is right now the #1 priority, but also going forward towards a nuclear deal. I think the main question that should be asked is, on the one hand, the B-1 bomber can drop tons and tons of munitions on Iranian targets, more than maybe any other aircraft in the U.S. arsenal. But at least at the moment, it is still unclear how effective it is on the final goal of reopening the strait. Some U.S. officials I talked to, defense officials, say that the Iranian ability to strike ships in the strait has been dramatically diminished, but other defense officials say that the Iranians can still do it. And therefore, I think we're still far off from the reopening of the strait, which is what President Trump wants at the moment.
You have some reporting as well on the new Mossad director meeting with the CIA chief on Iran. What comes out of that? What's the significance of this particular meeting?
I think the significance is that CIA Director John Ratcliffe was one of the more, let's say, skeptical members of Trump's inner circle. And I think that the Israelis at the moment see him, together with maybe Secretary of State Rubio, as the person who is more open to hear their point of view inside the administration. And I think that while, those interactions between director of Mossad and director of CAA are, relatively normal, that there's a very tight cooperation between the two intelligence agencies, I think that the timing 2 weeks ago, before the current escalation, but when the U.S. was about to start nuclear negotiations with Iran, I think that was the context of this visit, to try and make sure that the U.S. hears what Israel has to say before such negotiations start. And I think that that's why the new director of Mossad also met White House officials that are involved in the negotiations, in the nuclear negotiation with Iran. Since then, the situation's dramatically changed. I think over the last 2 weeks since that visit took place, the U.S. and the president is very close. And I think this might be something that people don't appreciate enough, how close the president is to giving an order for return to major combat operations in Iran, basically to go on Operation Epic Fury 2. I think people are not aware how close we are to such a thing. It could happen within days, because on the other hand, at least for now, and I hear it from the mediators, the Iranians still have not come back with a positive answer to the proposal they got from the Qatari mediators regarding the Strait of Hormuz. And I don't know how long President Trump is going to wait for that answer. And if it's not going to come in the next few days, I think it is highly likely that the president will order a return to major combat operations in Iran.
America's top diplomat has a blunt warning to Iran today about President Donald Trump's latest threats in the war. Secretary of State Marco Rubio speaking a short time ago on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit in the Philippines. Take a listen.
I think I saw Arachi, their foreign minister, who the other day say or something about their policies, an eye for an eye. The president's policy is a head for an eye. I mean, honestly, that's what it's going to be. I mean, they will pay a very heavy price for the things they're doing. They're already paying a very heavy price.
Rubio's comments come after his Iranian counterpart recently described his country's defense doctrine as an eye for an eye. On Wednesday, President Trump posted on social media that the U.S. would bomb and destroy one bridge or power plant anytime Iran targets a ship in the Strait of Hormuz. This is all coming as the U.S. hits Iran for a 13th straight night, with Iran firing back at regional neighbors, including Jordan. Nick Robertson is following developments for us from Jerusalem. Nick, good to see you. I mean, these are just escalatory comments, the rhetoric just upping the ante in terms of the probabilities of what could come next. And then you're hearing about Axios reporting around a B-1 bomber that will be deployed by the United States. There's a lot that's going on. Please unpack this for us.
Yeah, look, let's unpack this head for an eye and eye for an eye. These statements, Marco Rubio saying President Trump's doctrine is a head for an eye, and the foreign minister of Iran saying it's an eye for an eye. And that, as you say, came out of the statements of President Trump saying that if any ship was hit, he'd hit a bridge. The Iranians said that they would hit a bridge inside the Gulf countries. Now we've had a very, very real world example of an eye for an eye in the past hour or so. Overnight, one of the U.S. strikes hit an Iraqi-Iran border crossing right in the southwestern corner of Iran on the Iranian side, killing 2 people. Well, what has just happened in the past hour or so, less than 20 miles or so away from where that happened, an Iranian drone has been flown into an Iraqi-Kuwaiti border post, according to the Kuwaiti Defense Ministry. And that border, that Iraq-Kuwait border, very close to where the U.S. strike was, is now closed, or has certainly been closed because of this drone strike. So an eye for an eye doctrine isn't just rhetoric here right now. We're literally seeing it play out. How much further either side chooses to take this, how President Trump may want to respond for this attack, Iranian attack, on a border post there in Kuwait, an ally that houses many U.S. troops, remains to be seen. But the doctrine, according to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, ahead for an eye. So it's an escalation doctrine, and that's where we're at. We seem to be in escalation territory, and that seems to play into the reports we don't have confirmed yet that the U.S. using B-1 bombers as well, which is an escalation in its bombing capacity. These aircraft can carry 24 2,000-pound bombs or a dozen cruise missiles. They're very capable and they're very lethal.
Yeah, indeed. Look, President Trump, interestingly, has placed a new condition, and this is a story that we were covering yesterday, on this nuclear agreement with Saudi Arabia a day after formally approving it, saying that the country now must join the Abraham Accords. We know President Trump is very transactional. You know, everyone was surprised around allowing Saudi Arabia to have civilian nuclear enrichment on its soil without the International Atomic Energy Agency essentially having oversight. Are you surprised when you see this as being a caveat?
In a way, no. I mean, I think from the Israeli perspective, and there was a feeling here that allowing Saudi Arabia to enrich its own uranium and not have an international sort of inspection regime, have one brokered bilaterally with the United States, which the United States, and we heard this from Secretary of State Marco Rubio today, would be a strong and robust oversight, and better that the U.S. had that oversight than, let's say, it was Saudi Arabia was buying these civilian nuclear power plants from, let's say, Russia or China, that was a safer way to go. But here in Israel, the belief was this was a dangerous path, and I think the view was as well, certainly within the government circles, that the President Trump's position could be changed, that he has really created what I would interpret at the moment as an impossible hurdle for the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, to accept. He's been very, very clear since Israel's response to Hamas's attack in 2023, the Gaza war, more than 70,000 Palestinians killed, 1,200 Israelis killed, 250 taken hostage at the beginning, but more than 70,000 Palestinians killed. The Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia said quite simply, if I'm going to have normalization with Israel, there needs to be an Israeli recognition of a Palestinian state. And it's become apparent over time that the Crown Prince doesn't believe that's something Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to do. And the Prime Minister here has not given an indication he's willing to do it. So I think what President Trump has put up here is a roadblock for however long it may take to get around it or get over it, for the Saudis to move ahead with this deal. Now, will they throw it up in the air and turn to another country, which is sort of what Secretary Rubio was hinting their options had been prior to going down this path? Yes. Are we surprised that President Trump has changed his mind? He does change his mind. That's his prerogative. He's done it now. There was pushback from Israel.
Yeah, I mean, fascinating turn of events. I mean, the question is it going to bring Saudi Arabia to that table in terms of normalizing with Israel? Lots of questions there. Nick Robertson, always good to have you with us. Your analysis always so vital. I want to bring in CNN's Daniel Dale, who's been closely looking at some of President Trump's key claims about the war. Daniel, really good to have you with us. Look, President Trump has been pushing a triumphant narrative about Iran for military capability, control of the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, many people have a lot of thoughts about that. So give me a sense of what the reality is.
So one of the things President Trump has said repeatedly is that Iran's military has been completely eradicated. I want you to listen to just some of his comments on the subject.
Everything they have is gone, including their leadership. We've knocked out their Navy is gone, their Air Force is gone, most of their missiles are gone. We basically wiped out their military in about 2 weeks. Look, they have no military left.
It was always clear, even at the time he said this, that these were significant exaggerations, if not outright falsehoods. We know that Iran retains significant capabilities, and Iran has essentially fact-checked these claims with its own actions. Even after these comments, of course, it has been able to attack countries in the region, attack commercial shipping, and of course, attack of the United States, killing soldiers, injuring more than 100 U.S. service members in recent weeks. So this claim is just not true. And then on the Strait of Hormuz, President Trump has claimed at least twice this week that the United States completely controls it and Iran has no control over it. Listen to his comments on that subject.
We control the strait. They don't control anything.
Again, obviously untrue. In fact, just Tuesday, the U.S. Navy-controlled Joint Maritime Information Center based in Bahrain said that commercial shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz had fallen to a 3-week low, that IRGC harassment activity continued, that Iranian attacks on shipping in Omani waters in the area had been a significant deterrent to commercial shipping. So you can quibble about the definition of the word control, but it is entirely clear, and I think clear internationally, that Iran exerts significant influence over what happens in the Strait of Hormuz and has been the major reason why commercial traffic there is so low.
Trump is placing a new condition on the nuclear deal the U.S. has already signed with Saudi Arabia, potentially throwing the agreement into doubt. The U.S. president said the kingdom must now join the Abraham Accords in order for the pact to move forward. The Abraham Accords, signed during Trump's first term, is a deal brokered by the U.S., normalizing diplomatic ties between Israel and several Arab states. The president also emphasized that the agreement does not include uranium enrichment. Last hour, the White House press secretary had this to say when asked about one of the major challenges of getting Riyadh on board.
In the past, the Saudi government has said they will not consider entering into the Abraham Accords unless and until there's a Palestinian state. What makes you think that they're going to change their minds on their position regarding that?
Again, I won't get ahead of the president's conversations, but this is something that he feels very strongly about and has spoken about it in the past and will continue to uphold.
CNN's Kevin Liptak joins us live now from the White House. So I think what's interesting here is that Caroline Leavitt really downplayed the idea that the Saudis would be blindsided by this, that this shouldn't be a surprise because the president has talked about the importance of the Abraham Accords before. And yes, obviously we have heard the president talk about the importance of the Abraham Accords, but have we really heard the president tie the Abraham Accords to this? Because that seemed to be what she was suggesting. Kevin.
No, and when we saw the Energy Secretary Chris Wright signing this deal less than 24 hours ago, we also heard nothing about this new condition that the president is putting on the deal. Now, the idea of linking them together isn't necessarily new. It's something that the Biden administration attempted as well, trying to get Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with Israel as part of this broader pact that would also include a civilian nuclear arrangement with the United States. But that completely fell apart after the October 7th terrorist attacks by Hamas in Israel. And when the Trump administration restarted these discussions about the nuclear arrangement, they was completely divorced from the idea of normalization with Israel, in part because it doesn't seem as if Israel is ready to meet the conditions that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has put on that. You know, he has said very plainly that Saudi Arabia will not normalize those relations unless they see a viable pathway to Palestinian statehood. The Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has really taken that off the table at the moment because he says it is untenable with Israeli security. And so I think if you were the Saudis and you had this deal in place, you signed it, you put out statements sort of proclaiming it as a new way to bring the U.S. and Saudi Arabia closer, this will have surprised you, even though the president, yes, talks about the idea of Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords over and over. And Caroline Leavitt, I think when she was pressed about why this wasn't a stipulation that was made public as the deal was being signed, really didn't have much of an answer. She suggested that the president had not spoken to Mohammed bin Salman about this arrangement since he made it public a few hours ago. She also suggested that he hadn't spoken to Prime Minister Netanyahu about it either, which I do think leads to the question of who exactly got in the president's ear to convince him to attach this to the nuclear arrangement. arrangement. The other stipulation that he made this morning, which also came as something of a surprise, was that there would, quote, be no enrichment of material. He's talking about enriching uranium for civilian purposes. We haven't seen the actual text of the deal, but when we were speaking to officials yesterday, they did say that it included this multi-year study period to determine whether it was viable for Saudi Arabia to enrich its own uranium. And so he's throwing into this arrangement all these new conditions that were not made public yesterday. And I think that will lead to some questions about what the pathway forward is here. You know, this arrangement was really considered something of a triumph for Saudi Arabia and for the Crown Prince, who have been seeking something like this for such a long time, you know, years and years and years, even going back before the Biden administration. And now the president appears to be putting roadblocks and hurdles in place that in a lot of ways will be very difficult to overcome.
All right, Kevin Liptak, thank you for that. CNN's Nick Robertson is live with us from Jerusalem. So, Nick, obviously the Israelis were certainly concerned yesterday when this 30-year nuclear deal was announced between the US and Saudi Arabia. What's been the reaction among Israeli officials to this new precondition that President Trump has added?
It feels like a very positive reaction. And yesterday there was no official response to the stated terms, loose oversight and Saudi having its own enrichment. There was nothing coming from the Prime Minister's office, nobody from within the government. There were various people, former defense minister, former general, others in think tanks saying very clearly that this was dangerous, that it would lead to proliferation, a potential nuclear arms race in the region. There was a high level of dissatisfaction. But very quickly after this announcement came out from President Trump on Truth Social, we heard from the Prime Minister's office saying quite simply that the United States and Israel working together against Iran and Israel against its proxies have helped widen the circle of peace in the region. And the Prime Minister's office quoted President Trump saying that if Saudi Arabia was to join the Abraham Accords, that would be historic. It really does fly in the face of the logic of getting the deal done. I think, look, just take an even bigger step back from this, because I think we have to at this moment, because it's such an abrupt about face. It's such an immediate curtailing for all the reasons Kevin Saudi getting this civil nuclear program with the United States. It brings that to an abrupt screeching halt. It really just builds up that question that's brewing here in the region at the moment. What is President Trump doing? What are his tactics to win again with Iran? The oil price of oil now over $100 a barrel, or at least it has been earlier today. What is his tactic? Does he know what he's doing? So something that comes as such a surprise as this is only going to feed into that assessment. What is the president doing? Who's giving him the advice? The region is in a mess. How are we going to help him and the United States get out of it? Because this region, Saudi, all the others, do not want a continuing war that stops their products getting to international markets.
Right. Nick Robertson, live for us. Thank you so much. All right. As the US and Iran trade dangerous threats, it is the Iranian people, of course, who feel the brunt of this conflict the most. Some residents in Tehran are expressing anxiety after the US escalated lethal attacks deep into parts of northern Iran. One man in the Iranian capital says the time for negotiating has passed.
I don't think there's any need for us to sit down for talks, understanding, or compromise anymore. Given what has happened, I believe we have to see this through to the end and finish it. Either death or life, one of those will happen. And that's better than this cycle of war followed by peace and everything else.
Negar Mortazavi is a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy and the host of the Iran podcast. She joins us live now from Washington. Nega, thank you so much for being with us. You know, it's always hard to get a sense of how ordinary civilians in Iran are feeling because of obviously security restrictions and internet disruptions. And obviously it's impossible to generalize. You're dealing with tens of millions of people. But there are, of course, some who support the regime, others who are fiercely opposed to it. For those who are fiercely opposed to this regime, for those who had hoped that somehow the US intervention would lead to regime change, do those people still believe at this point that the US has their best interests at heart?
Thanks for having me. No, I don't think so. And I mean, I would add a third group, which is sort of a big gray area somewhere in the middle, who is unhappy with the status quo, very much opposed with social, political, economic grievances, but also never saw this foreign intervention as the quote unquote help that President Trump had suggested. And since the war has actually happened and unfolded, I think it's become clear, even for most of the people who thought that this would change things on the ground, that not only didn't it help Iranian protesters or the Iranian people, it actually made things worse. And considering the number of the death toll, the civilian death toll, almost 4,000 Iranians dead, most of them civilians, many children, lots of civilian infrastructure has been damaged, destroyed. The war opened with an attack on a school full of children, hospitals, universities, cultural heritage, which have nothing to do with any government. They've been there for centuries. And also the US president tweeting or truth socialing multiple times that he wants to wipe out a civilization or destroy a civilization. That has nothing to do with the government. It's very much, you know, portraying the war as a war on Iran and Iranians. And I think that's what most people understand, regardless of where they stand politically vis-a-vis their own government.
You know, I'm so glad you brought up this sort of third category, this idea that there are people who might be opposed to the Iranian regime, but were skeptical as to whether or not the United States would really be there for them in the way that they had promised. And I think it's important to note that in the past 5 years, you know, for the Iranian people who are opposed to this regime, you've seen, you know, moments of hope, oscillating between moments of hope and then deep, deep disappointment. We all remember in 2022, the Mahsa Amini protests. A lot of people were saying at that time that that represented the most sort of serious threat to the Iranian regime that we've seen in many years. And then the crackdown afterwards by security forces was so severe that, of course, you know, hopes were extinguished very quickly. We also saw the economic protests several months ago, the US intervention with the killing of the Ayatollah, the latest ceasefire, which only lasted a few days. You're sort of seeing this oscillation for the Iranian people who are opposed to the regime, lots of hope and then a lot of despair. So if all the sort of events that I've listed just now, the various protests, whether it's Mahsa Amini, economic protests, the US intervention, the US killing the Ayatollah, none of that has worked to bring about change, then what will?
Well, you know, that's the million-dollar question, right? It's very difficult, but I think what serious activists and change makers inside the country keep saying is that change has to happen by Iranians inside Iran and the way they want it. Now, there may be disagreements or differences of opinion, but bombing schools full of children, universities and hospitals, homes, as we can just see on the screen. This is a home. This is not a government building. That's just not going to bring change. It's not going to bring better governance or transparency or democracy. It's not going to remove repression in the country. In fact, you can argue that the war and this sort of security environment has made political dissent even more difficult. It's closed the space for any form of opposition or dissent. Do we see any protests on the street? No. Part of the reason is because of this external foreign threat that has made things much worse. And, you know, most Iranians look to their neighbors, to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to these places where the US has used hard power, immense hard power, and even to the point of regime change to supposedly bring a better future, better governance, democracy, nation building, even in the case of Afghanistan, women's rights. And none of that happened. You can argue matters have become even worse. And I think that's also reflected in the opinion of Americans. The American public, majority polls show, are opposed to these kind of endless pointless wars in the Middle East because they don't bring the promises either from a U.S. national security perspective, destroying the nuclear program, changing the regime, or from an Iranian perspective, helping the Iranian people, making things better for them. None of that happens. It's just U.S. blood and treasure that's wasted, lots of Iranian lives, as you pointed, civilian infrastructure that's going to take years to rebuild and reconstruct.
I want you to sort of lay out for us what life is like in Iran for ordinary people right now, given the war. You know, I mean, I think all of us will agree that the sort of fallout from this war between the United States and Iran is certainly lopsided. Here in the United States, it's felt through, obviously, yes, the death of 18 American servicemen and women, which is obviously very tragic for this country. But also it's largely felt through the effects of higher gas prices, which is a major political issue. And of course, for people who are living below the poverty line, who are living below a certain income threshold, the price of gas affects your daily lives in multiple ways. But the effects in Iran, I mean, you're talking about death, destruction, injury, you know, people having to bury family members. Obviously, there was that horrible attack on that elementary school in the early days of the war. I mean, obviously, there is a massive difference between how both countries are experiencing the effects of this war inside their countries. Just talk to us about how ordinary civilians in Iran are experiencing this.
Absolutely. So as you laid out, you know, the war is waged over there, so it's not felt as closely here in the U.S., although yes, the death of, you know, every death is tragic. The death of service members, and then also it's reflected in gas prices. In Iran, it's reflected in every aspect of daily life. First of all, security, you know, from the viewpoint of a civilian, no matter where you live in the country, because areas across the country have been hit. You don't know if you're the next target, if your home is the next target or the next collateral next to a target, if your child's school is going to be the next target, the hospital, the university, the road that you're about to go on. So it's seen from the viewpoint of civilians, very, very arbitrary. And, you know, 4,000 people have been killed. And so that's evidence and lots of destruction. And we're just seeing more images coming up because there was also an internet blackout in the country. So we haven't seen enough images in real time of the destruction in Iran. Now we're getting to see them. And then also inflation, of course, it's reflected in the Iranian economy across the board. It's not just gas prices like here in the US, it's the price of everything, everyday goods. Although the country is running, it's interesting how the government has been able to maintain some form of, you know, public service has been ongoing, and there hasn't been, let's say, shortages of any basic goods reported, but still inflation and that increase in price is something that civilians talk about a lot. And then, of course, this idea of your safety and security, which is first and foremost when you hear the bombs, when you hear the jets flying, and when you don't know which city, which neighborhood is going to be next. It's very, very horrific. And of course, people who have lost loved ones are still grieving for them.
When all is said and done and this war is over, and of course we all hope it will be soon, what will be the consequence for the Iranian people? I think that there are some who fear that the Iranian regime would have learnt the wrong lesson and perhaps crack down on the Iranian people even more. I mean, obviously in this kind of environment, you're not going to see protests, and perhaps with the Iranian people, there is, you know, political scientists refer to revolutionary fatigue, when you've tried and tried again so many times to perhaps, you know, through protests or through political activism, to try to sort of steer things democratically in a different direction, and your efforts don't amount to much. Just explain to us whether there is that fear that the security forces in Iran will crack down even more on the Iranian people after this war is said and done than they did prior to this war.
Right. I mean, certainly right now, like I said, there's a securitized environment, very little room for dissent, for any form of overt political dissent. After the war is done, we don't know when that is because it keeps, you know, stopping. But after it's done, I'm not sure, because this is also sort of a new chapter for the Islamic Republic. I hope they will learn some lessons from the war. But also the society, I don't think the grievances are going to go away. The political, economic, social grievances, none of those will disappear. Yes, now there's no room for public presentation of any form of dissent. But I think once this external foreign threat is removed, the idea of getting bombed any minute, then this will be more internal between the state and the society. And that gap has been really wide, and they will have to address it or close the gap. Economic grievances are very, very serious. People's livelihood has been the reason for many protests over the years. And that we also see that reflected in how Iran is trying to negotiate. So one of the main demands in their negotiations from the U.S. is economic relief. They understand that there has to be economic relief. They're looking for their frozen assets. They're looking for sanctions relief from the U.S. because that problem is very, very severe. So we'll have to wait and see in long term if they can address any of these grievances or not, if this new chapter is going to have more openings. So after, for example, just one example, the Masa Amini protest, Women, Life, Freedom, this society, yes, there was repression, but the society, women, young people were able to push the state back one step and make some achievements because of the very high price that they paid in those protests. So now you, for example, look at public life in Iran, the dress code, mandatory hijab, the core of that, of those protests, they have made some gains and they have been able to push the state back. But, it's very slow process. It's been coming at a very high cost. And what I want to reiterate is that this foreign, external, hard power military attack is not going to make things better. In fact, it may even make it worse in the long term.
As a new front opens in the war with Iran, the US is drawing closer to one of Iran's biggest regional rivals with the landmark nuclear deal. But a major new condition just announced by Donald Trump is threatening to torpedo the agreement already signed by Saudi Arabia. Now, there's a lot for us to cover this hour, but I do want to start in the Red Sea, where Iranian-backed Houthis say they hit 2 Saudi oil tankers, carrying out a threat to impose a blockade against Saudi shipment. Now, President Trump says up until now, Houthis have acted very professionally and smart during the Iran war. Those were his words. He's warning of major military punishment if these attacks continue. Mr. Trump also imposing a major condition today, as I was saying earlier, on the agreement to give Saudi Arabia technology for a civilian nuclear program. He says it will only happen if the kingdom signs the Abraham Accords, normalizing relations with Israel. The White House insists that was always the plan.
This is a condition that the president has spoken about many times with our Gulf and Arab allies. He wants to see these countries sign the Abraham Accord. It was one of the most historic accomplishments of his first term, and it continues to be a long-term goal of his to expand those accords to ultimately come to a place where the Middle East can be a peaceful and stable region. And yes, this deal with Saudi Arabia, the energy deal, is contingent on this condition as far as the president is concerned.
We'll go live to our Nick Robertson in Jerusalem in just a moment. But first, I do want to go to Kristen Holmes, who's at the White House. So, Kristen, I'm a bit confused, to be honest, because the nuclear agreement with the Saudis was signed last night. Now we've got this condition. And, the White House saying there, Caroline Levitt saying that was always the plan. So why wasn't this announced pre the signing, 24 hours ago?
Well, that's the big question. And it sounded like from Caroline Levitt during this briefing that President Trump raised this morning for the first time, despite the fact that she's also said it was always going to be part of the plan. We asked her whether or not Saudi Arabia had agreed to sign the Abraham Accords. She said that President Trump had not talked to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia since he set this condition earlier this morning and would not give any more details than that. In the past, Saudi Arabia has said it would not normalize relations with Israel unless there was a clear pathway to Palestinian statehood, which Israel has said they will not do. So how this actually moves forward, that's a huge question here. But there is also this question of, well, what did they sign? And what is the meaning of them actually signing something if it's not going to go into effect? And how you kind of place a last-minute condition on something that, again, has already been signed. Now, there was a lot of negativity around this deal from senators that he talks to. There was also a lot of bad press around it, people calling for this deal not to happen. So perhaps President Trump was looking at some of that, talking to these senators, and wanted to come up with some kind of way to sweeten the pot for him, for the White House. But whatever the reason being, it's still very unclear how this deal can be quote unquote off for a contingency that was placed after both sides had signed this deal moving forward.
Yeah, look, we haven't heard from Saudi Arabia, but we did hear from Caroline Levitt saying if Saudi Arabia doesn't sign it, the deal is off. So we'll have to see what Riyadh has to say on this. Let's turn, though, in the meantime, to Iran, because we are starting to see rhetoric really hardening, Kristen, on both sides, with Secretary Uber talking about an eye for an eye. This comes after days of threats, and now we have the Houthis escalating. What is the strategy? What is your sense of the messaging getting from the administration regarding the strategy going ahead, given what we have seen from the Houthis?
It is so deeply unclear what the strategy is of the administration. And that is even more amplified today after CNN has new reporting that the CIA and the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, have recently assessed that this kind of nightly strikes and the bombing that the United States is currently engaged in is not likely to move the Iranian negotiating position. So what exactly are they going to do? Because right now these two sides remain in a deadlock. And I hear this kind of optimism from members of the administration, from senior officials who say within the next 2 weeks things will settle down, but there's no clear reasoning as to how things will start to settle down. And a reminder is that there was this kind of ceasefire, 10-day ceasefire that was presented by mediators to the White House. Since then, the White House, President Trump has continued to order these strikes every night, obviously dismissing it. We were told by a U.S. official at the time that President Trump is still getting back or retaliating against Iran for both breaking the ceasefire and for the death of American troops. But at this point, it just is unclear where he goes from now. Now, he did a brief phone interview with another reporter where he said he's considering a massive military strike. Unclear if that meant troops on the ground or some kind of amplified military action than the kind of strikes that we're seeing every night right now. But he's been saying that for several weeks. So this isn't kind of a new statement. This idea that he has been weighing his options has been happening for quite some time.
Stay with us, Kristen. We've got our Nick Robertson with us, who's joining us from Jerusalem. So, Nick, Kristen and I were talking about this deal this nuclear agreement that we were hearing, and the United States saying now it won't happen unless normalization, of course, goes through on the Abraham Accords. From what I understand, and you know this story better than most, Saudi Arabia has previously said they would not recognize Israel without the establishment of a Palestinian state. So how realistic then is this condition? Because Caroline Levitt, the White House press secretary, said a few hours ago, if Saudi Arabia doesn't sign, the deal is off.
Look, to me, from all the conversations I've had with Saudi diplomats, the top tier and rungs down below over the past couple of years, the message, and I've kept pushing back on, well, can't you sort of do a normalization? Isn't that going to improve the situation? And you know, there's a peace in Gaza now, which has been a big part of the problem. How Israel responded to Hamas's brutal attacks on October the 7th. 1,200 Israelis killed, 250 Israelis taken hostage, and more than 70,000 Palestinians killed in the aftermath. The Saudis, the message I've got back every single time, and it's become stronger and clearer without equivocation, that unless Israel is willing to recognize a Palestinian state, a viable, sort of reversible pathway to a Palestinian state, then there's no moving forward on normalization. And the frank assessment in Saudi Arabia is that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu isn't the Prime Minister of Israel that can deliver that, because they don't believe that he sincerely wants to have a Palestinian state, and they've listened to the times when he has uttered those words. So it does seem to me what the White House has introduced here, and look, let's face it, this was a pretty big about turn. It is a roadblock at the moment. There could be ways around it. Let's not preclude that. Don't expect the Saudis to go public with their anger and frustration. They're very good at keeping that in. But I would say just look at where we are tonight. just to bring in the Houthis, and they're hitting Saudi oil tankers in the Red Sea. And President Trump saying, if you do that again, I'll come in and hit you Houthis and I'll hit you Iran because you're behind it. And the Saudis, from the sources I've been talking to, have been saying that if the Houthis were to do this sort of action, then the Saudis would have a military response against the Houthis. That could be a pretty big escalation. To do that, they're going to want to know that they have the United States at their back. If you're in Riyadh right now and you're trying to figure out what is your move against the Houthis and where is President Trump behind you on that, what is said today, can you count on it tomorrow? This is sort of just a microcosm, a small slice, if you will, of the uncertainty that's going on in this region at the moment.
Such great insight on the Houthi front, Nick. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it for us there in Jerusalem. Also to Kristen Holmes at the White House. Well, the EU is calling the Houthis' threats to impose a maritime blockade, as Nick was saying there in the Red Sea, a dangerous escalation, saying it could jeopardize regional stability. The Iran-backed militants are threatening to shut the Bab al-Mandab passage to vessels linked to Saudi Arabia. And that could put an even heavier strain on international shipping as hundreds of ships remain stranded in the Strait of Hormuz. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas is calling on Yemen's Houthis to cease all actions that could endanger international shipping. Let's get more on this. I'm joined now by Colin Clark, the Executive Director of the Sufan Center. Colin, great to have you back on the show. Look, the last time you and I spoke, we were talking not many months ago, we were discussing the threat from the Houthis, and here we are again with the Houthis seemingly making good on their threat to target Saudi ships in the Red Sea. How significant is this, and what do you make of what you just heard? I'm hoping you heard what Nick was saying there of the Saudis and how they respond to this.
Thanks for having me, Issa. You're right, we've been having this conversation since the war kicked off back in late February, and a lot of speculation at the time was which of Iran's proxies would jump into the mix and come to Tehran's aid. The Houthis have largely sat this conflict out, and most, including myself, suspected that wasn't because of a lack of capability, but because the Iranians were holding them as an ace up their sleeve or keeping them around for a rainy day. I think what this conflict has proven so far is that Iran has a real knack for timing, and it understands this phased approach to the war, hence the timing of Houthi involvement when oil is going up and there's a lot of political pressure on Trump. This was well played by the Iranians. However, it could still escalate if the Saudis are now dragged in.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask my producer, Vicky, can you bring up that map again? Just want to show viewers where the Bab al-Mandab Strait is. Bidik is the choke point, right, at the southern end of the Red Sea. There we go. If we bring the banner down so people can see it, right, you can see it now. Look, it isn't as crucial, the Strait of Hormuz, but it still matters. I think 6.2 million barrels of oil have been traveling, I was looking at it today, through the Strait every day for the past month. So the question then becomes, Colin, how does the U.S. react? What does President Trump do about this? Because on Tuesday, he was shrugging off the threat of the Houthis, saying, I think he said something, we'll just have to take care of business. How does he do this?
Look, the president's coming across as a one-trick pony because he's threatening overwhelming force. Well, if bombing the Houthis was effective, they would have been defeated by now. That's clearly not the case. Think about the favorable terrain in northwestern Yemen, very mountainous cave complexes. The Houthis are masters of the shoot and scoot, shooting drones and missiles and then getting back, into places where they're not as vulnerable. This is one of the world's leading terrorist and insurgent groups. And moreover, if you think about who's in charge now in Iran, right? The IRGC hardliners that are now running the country, they've spent the past 2 decades watching the United States fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. They understand the pressure points. They understand the leverage that asymmetric warfare brings. And frankly, I think they understand quite well domestic political constraints that the president's facing at the moment.
Yeah, let's broaden that conversation, if you don't mind, because and the strategy here from Iran, because Secretary Rubio said Iran is begging for a deal. I'm not sure whether you heard him say that. But meantime, we have seen Iran hitting Kuwait, hitting Jordan, Bahrain, bringing Houthis into the fold. So what is the message from Iran, and what could they have next up their sleeve?
Well, I don't think the Iranians are begging for a deal. I think that's a smokescreen from the administration because they've been caught flat-footed. I think what's next for Iran, there's a number of different pressure points in addition to their proxies. Think about their mosaic defense. It's very layered. It's very decentralized. They've clearly retained the ability to launch missiles and drones at Gulf Arab states to disrupt the global economy and essentially hold it hostage. And we haven't even gotten into Iranian transnational terrorism capabilities. One of my concerns in March was the potential for sleeper cells, either in the United States or elsewhere in the West and Europe. That's something that we haven't seen yet. Is it because that capability doesn't exist? Or is it because that's just another tripwire that the Iranians are looking to use should things escalate further, i.e. a potential U.S. military ground invasion?
As more ships come under attack, this is what we know. First, the Strait of Hormuz, now the Red Sea, a second crucial Middle East waterway for oil tankers, is now engulfed in the escalating war with Iran. Iranian-backed Houthis say they hit 2 Saudi oil tankers today, carrying out a threat to impose a blockade against Saudi shipping. Satellite imagery from NASA appears to show one of the ships on fire. US President Donald Trump says he'll hold Iran responsible if attacks continue, warning of major military punishment. The attack sent oil prices surging past $100 a barrel for the first time since May. Let's bring in Kevin Lipdak at the White House. Kevin, this is a huge concern because there are 2 main routes for oil to get out of the Middle East, and they are now both under threat.
Right. It's another choke point in the global oil trade, and it is another front in the Iran war for a president who at this point has not articulated a particularly clear endgame about how he sees this all going. And so for him, I think this is just an added headache to what has become a fairly bleak picture in the Middle East. And his message this morning conveyed a certain level of disappointment at this Iran-backed rebel group, the Houthis, that are in Yemen, saying that until now they had, quote, acted very professionally and smart by not getting involved in the Iran war, and saying that he was, quote, very disappointed in them for now both firing on those tankers in the Red Sea, but also enacting this blockade of Saudi shipping in this very critical waterway. And so whether or not the president now becomes dragged in to an entirely different part of the Middle East remains to be seen, but he is suggesting that that is an outcome that he sees very likely and very possible if the Houthis continue down this route. Now, we were just hearing from the president. He was at an unrelated event over at the EPA, and he did touch on the war in Iran briefly, saying that in his view it was going, quote, very, very well, and that the Saudis did want to come back to the negotiating table, but that, quote, they were not ready yet in terms of what concessions they were prepared to offer. And, you know, when you talk to regional diplomats, they are fairly pessimistic that at this point the negotiations are going to resume. You know, they have been trying to get this de-escalation plan back on the table. They've proposed a 10-day ceasefire that would lower the temperatures, bring the two sides back to some sort of discussions, but they say that the prospects for that, at least for now, appear very, very bleak. And that does lead the question of where this is all heading. You know, when you talk to officials here at the White House, there are some concerns that this strategy of night-by-night strikes on Iran, we just had the 12th night Wednesday into Thursday, that does not appear to be working. That the Iranians have so far not moved off of any of their negotiating positions, and that is leading, I think, to some very difficult discussions in the White House about what exactly comes next. Now, in public, the president is previewing a major escalation. He's talked about going after Pickaxe Mountain, the highly fortified nuclear site that's buried under 400 feet of solid rock. He's talked about going after roads and bridges in Iran, some of that nuclear or that civilian infrastructure. But so far, he has not executed on any of those threats. And I think there is some concern that we're just sort of locked in an impasse. And it is a deadly impasse, given what the Iranians have shown they are still capable of in terms of firing on American troops that are arrayed across the Middle East. And so the president's still at a decision point here, but at least when it comes to the Houthis and this additional front of the war, ramping up the threats as well.
Kevin, at the White House, thank you so much for that. We're going to check on the oil prices right now because Brent crude, which is the global benchmark, is up close to 7% in just one day. $100 a barrel. WTI crude above $90 a barrel now. Anna, you've been watching this. I mean, it was skirting with $100. Now it's firmly above it, isn't it? It seems to be going up. And this is because there's no good outcome to these two oil routes being disrupted.
Yeah, we're now looking at essentially a double chokehold in terms of the two straits, and investors increasingly back to pricing in a prolonged oil crisis. The Strait of Hormuz obviously effectively closed at this point. There were 15 crossings yesterday. That's around a tenth of what we would have seen before the war in Iran. But now more interesting to watch is the Red Sea as well. Now, the reason the Red Sea is so relevant at this point is for Saudi Arabia. There have been security issues around this passage and with the Bab el-Mandeb Strait for many years, with Houthi militants, increasingly a sort of a risk around the area. We were talking years ago about ships taking the very long way around, for instance, with cargo, the Cape of Good Hope, having to make a very long transit, pushing up inflation, etc. The reason this renewed risk is so devastating now in terms of oil prices is because Saudi Arabia has been relying on this other route through the Red Sea to export the oil they couldn't get out the Strait of Hormuz. They have been piping around 70% of their crude oil exports across the entire country to reach the Red Sea so they could export it from that route. Now, with two vessels attacked, the question is how many ships will.
The temporary strikes on Iran does seem to be holding at this hour amid growing concerns over the conflict escalating further. Sources telling CNN the president was briefed by Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman Dan Kane on Friday. The general reportedly telling Trump that carrying out more aggressive moves could further deplete stockpiles, along with other potential downsides. Some Republican lawmakers also signaling some uncertainty about the direction of this war.
At some point, date certain, it'll be that Congress has to weigh in. It may be soon, but in my mind, the president's had the opportunity to achieve the initial goals, which I agreed with, to wrap it up. It's not happened. At this point, I do think there needs to be a fuller national discussion as to how we go forward.
Joining us now in the group chat, retired Lieutenant General Karen Gibson, former Deputy Director of National Intelligence and a Senior Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Strategies. General, it's good to have you here. So when we parse through what we're hearing, right, about these concerns that were raised by General Kane, about the military stockpiles in this moment, what does it tell you about the math here?
Well, I think at any time that you're using weapons faster than the industrial base can replenish them, then of course your stockpiles are going to diminish to some point. The question is it dangerous? What kinds of shortages might we encounter? And it's important to remember that it's not just U.S. forces that use these expensive interceptors, but also our Gulf partners. We provide similar kinds of capacity in the past in the Republic of Korea or to Ukraine. And so it can become a global supply problem if we are depleting them too rapidly. And each time that Iran launches missiles or one-way attack drones, it requires the expenditure of these scarce resources.
So to your point, right, about where else these munitions are being used, I want to play a little bit of what we touched on this briefly, but we have the sound now. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Mike Waltz, had to say about that specifically.
We inherited a difficult situation with many of our munitions having been given over in Ukraine, a lot of them expended in the Houthis, but we are rebuilding with cheaper, faster, more technologically capable as we are conducting this campaign.
Recognizing, what has happened before, it does beg the question of Shouldn't that have been taken into account before going into this war, knowing that it could last longer?
Yeah, so I would say two things. One, I think the shortfalls in the defense industrial base have been long-standing. It's one of the 4 priorities of the new defense strategy is to rebuild that. But two, certainly I think the initial planning for this campaign did not anticipate that it would go this long.
We have heard from the president about how Iran's military capabilities have been depleted. What are you seeing?
Yeah, so they've been dramatically depleted, right? But not eliminated. And frankly, eliminating them is darn near impossible. You look at the very narrow Strait of Hormuz that we're trying to protect and the vast geography from which Iran can attack it with cheap, relatively easy to produce, easy to hide, one-way attack drones. And when I, as an intelligence professional, look at an enemy's what they might do, I look at two things. One, what is their will and intent? And Iran has been very clear that they intend to control navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. And what is their ability to do so? And in terms of their ability to do so, we've degraded that considerably, but not eliminated it. And in terms of their will and intent, there's really no indications that we've moved the needle on that. They still insist that they will control the straits. And so I'm not sure, while it's been tactically effective and tactically we've degraded tremendous capabilities, we haven't achieved our strategic aims.
I just want to ask you one more question on that point. So Aaron David Miller over the weekend was talking on CNN. I spoke with him a little bit about this yesterday. Talking about, when you talk about the will, right, there's also the will of Iranian leadership to keep going and to be able to inflict pain on their own people. That is incredibly strong.
Oh, yes.
And is it proving to be more strong in this moment than you think was anticipated?
Well, I think some people underestimated the willingness, one, of the Islamic Republic or the men who are in charge to absorb pain. And the well-being of the Iranian people has never been a top priority. I think people also forget that for them, this is an existential fight for the survival of the state. And so their willingness and ability to absorb that kind of pain, whether it's in the form of punishing airstrikes or years-long sanctions regimes, is very high. They are not making the kind of calculations that a nation who put their economic likelihood as their top priority would make. You know, I think there were perhaps some assumptions that they won't choke off the strait because it'll hurt them economically. They won't attack Gulf states because they need them to remain neutral. And those are the kind of rational decisions that a nation that was economically minded might make. But when you're in an existential fight for the survival of the Islamic Republic, your calculus is different.
And in terms of the calculus, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but the fact that, and we heard from Senator Cassidy there, right? The fact that congressional funding, right, is going to plays an important role here. Sarah, how do you see all of this figuring in now in this moment, as the American people, as we know from every poll that comes out, are increasingly dissatisfied with where things stand?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that Americans don't think about, but you know that military officials think about, strategic officials think about, is if we were to get into a situation where allies depended on us, let's say China were to invade Taiwan, and our stockpile is low. That is a very, very serious long-term national security issue for us. Now, I don't think that the American people are demanding answers to that of their politicians as we head into the midterms. What they are demanding answers on is the economic priorities that you just mentioned, and those things are going to be very, very seriously felt if we cannot figure out the stockpile issues. So, for example, if we cannot figure this out with the strait, if the strait doesn't remain open and we can't get free trade to go through, there's no way gas prices are going down ahead in the midterms. By the way, even if we got the strait open, there's probably no way that they're going to go down in time for midterms. That's the biggest priority for voters right now. And if you're Congress, you don't want to be in a position where you're voting against funding in a way that it's going to come down to the way that it's hitting people's prices at the pump, in grocery stores, and all those things. So they've got some delicate dancing to do. But I do think that the bigger strategic concern is it's not actually about some of these short-term economic pains. It's what do we do if we have no stockpile, China invades Taiwan, our allies in the southeastern part of the world are dependent on us. That becomes a pretty serious problem.
All right, breaking this morning, global oil prices falling sharply. Look at that. Brent crude was up over $100 a barrel at one point last week. Why is it dropping? The United States appears to have paused its bombing raids on Iran. New reporting suggests high-level concerns in the administration about dwindling reserves of U.S. air defense munitions. Let's get ready to see CNN's Kevin Liptak at the White House. It's pretty interesting. What's the White House saying about this, Kevin?
Yeah, and we have now had 3 days of relative calm after that 13-day stretch where we saw those night-by-night attacks. And it does come even after the president was threatening this major escalation in Iran. There was a discussion at the White House on Friday discussing both the efficacy of those night-by-night strikes, but also about the potential risks for escalation. And what we're told is that both the Vice President, J.D. Vance, and General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, raised concerns about escalation, and that Kane, in particular, has warned about the potential for dwindling stockpiles of U.S. munitions, including air defense interceptors. Now, the administration strongly denies that that is an issue. What Mike Walls, the American ambassador to the United Nations, said yesterday is that, quote, the military has everything it needs to conduct this campaign as effectively as it needs to be. And also claiming, somewhat contradictory there, that anyone leaking information about weapon stockpiles deserves to be in jail. Now, there were a few other concerns that were raised in this meeting, including the potential for a wider regional retaliation. The president also hearing concerns about the potential for civilian deaths inside of Iran if he went after some of those civilian infrastructure sites that he'd been repeatedly warning he would attack, including bridges, power plants, that sort of thing. Now, what the administration is also saying today is that they want space for the diplomacy to proceed, and I am told this morning that that is still continuing. The mediators, including Pakistan and Qatar, still in discussions to try and get the two sides back to the negotiating table. You all have on an open discussion discussing the news. You've seen President Trump doing over the weekend is continuing this relatively belligerent approach on social media. He posted almost a dozen AI-generated images of the U.S. oil tankers, of the U.S. striking our island, including oil sites on a critical export site. Now, the president is still continuing to have these diplomatic discussions. He's expected to discuss the situation with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He's saying the U.S. President's funeral tomorrow. Israel is pretty clear that it thinks the U.S. has unfinished business inside of Iran.
Now, the top U.S. official, President Trump, is giving talks around quote-unquote some space. Now, after nearly 2 straight weeks of bombing, there's also new reporting that suggests that the president is facing growing warnings from within about escalating further. Fresh concern raised by some of his closest advisors, concern from both the Vice President, J.D. Vance, and the Joint Chiefs Chairman, General Dan Kane. According to a source familiar, General Kane even specifically raised worry about depleting the U.S. munition stockpiles further if the fighting continues. Also, overnight, Iranian officials ramped up their threats towards Ukraine. This is after Ukraine this weekend launched an attack on an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea. Let's talk about where things stand now with CNN Global Affairs analyst Brett McGurk. He's also the author of the new book coming out, Brink, Inside the Race to Free the October 7 Hostages. It's good to see you. Thanks for being here. So let's talk about their pause moment. That seems to be, I think, the only clear thing when it comes to that of the war, because 2 weeks of U.S. bombing runs on Iran have seemed to fail to break the deadlock over the Strait of Hormuz still. And now you have reporting that there's a concern that was raised this week about further depleting munition stockpiles if the president escalates this further. How do they navigate a path forward now, Brett? What do you see here?
Kate, it's tough. You know, we're 5 months tomorrow will be the 5-month mark of when this conflict started. And I was saying, I used to work in the White House for various visits from General Eisenhower, who was president. He used to say, before we talk about decisive military action, lay out all the facts cold and hard. And it appears from the reporting from CNN and elsewhere, this meeting last week did that. And here are all the factors as we start to accept that. Good. It's exactly the type of information that you're getting, probably the type of meeting that should have happened before it started. But where are we now? I call this state a tactical pause. I think we heard nights of strikes. The actions up through a month to try it straight back where it was before the strike started 2 weeks ago. And that total progress. So to pause, let's see where we are, see if the plan somewhere. But there was kind of a key variable remains Strait of Hormuz. And if Iran is going to maintain the Strait of Hormuz territory, it controls what is through the state. I see Washington accepting that, nor do the Gulf states accept that. And therefore, you're kind of stuck. So it's a week, Kate. We had visits come from Washington. Now here, Zelensky here. We'll see diplomacy go. But right now, tactical pause.
Well, let's talk about the news on Ukraine this weekend. Italian one coming over from Iran. Regional governor is Ukraine too soon come to understand that Iran does not let actions go unanswered. What does this do?
Kate, this is for a little way back. Iran has been supporting Russia in its war against Ukraine directly. They provide Shahed drones. They provide technology. They have a factory producing the Iranian Shahed drone, which allows Iran to prosecute its war. This has been going on for years. And Zelensky, about 3 days ago, said that the Ukrainians struck a ship in the Caspian Sea carrying military material between Russia and Iran. Iran is now claiming that this is basically an act of war. Iran is now threatening to attack Ukraine. So this is how these two storylines come together. But the cooperation between Russia and and Iran has been going on for some time. But this will be a topic in the Oval Office when Zelensky meets President Trump. Totally different dynamic. That infamous meeting about 18 months ago. Now Ukraine arguably has the upper hand. There's a sanctions bill pending still in the Senate, and Zelensky's coming with some cards. And he's saying he's going to lay out to the president his information on what Russia is doing to put Iran in conflict against us. So this is how these two threats come together. Cooperation between Russia, Iran, and China is a larger backdrop of everything we're talking about day by day here, Kate. And that's a very important meeting in the Oval Office this week.
All right, thank you, Kate. Global oil prices are falling sharply as the U.S. and Iran have so far paused strikes. The third day in a row, no strikes from either side after nearly 2 straight weeks of nightly bombing. And this comes as U.S. officials, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Jordan Kane, are warning about the dwindling supply of U.S. air defense munitions. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations also weighing in, saying President Trump is giving diplomatic effort to chance.
What the president is doing right now, as we've seen all along, is giving talks some space. Talks are ongoing. They're happening at every level.
CNN's Zach Cohen is joining me now. Zach, he also said, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, that the troops have all they need when it comes to this fight with Iran. But we're hearing about these dwindling munitions. What's the sense going on here, Zach?
Yes, Sarah. Ambassador Waltz did say that the U.S. has all the munitions it needs, but that does not line up with what we've been reporting, frankly, since back in April, when analysts and Pentagon data has shown that Pentagon's munitions, including these key missile defense systems, are running low because of the high frequency with which they're being used in war with Iran. And while the White House and Trump administration is arguing that the temporary pause over the last 3 days is intended to space for diplomacy, we learned details about a consequential meeting that took place at the White House on Friday when discussions were had of potentially escalating the conflict with Iran. All of the president's top advisors were in the room hold, and there's some hard truths laid out for the president by Vice President J.D. Vance and Chairman of Joint Chiefs Dan Kane, been warning about potential concerns related to the options for escalating this conflict. And Kane, in point to the clip they've used so far as conflict, they may not have enough for the next war, especially if it's an adversary like China or Russia. Now, this is just one concern we're told that was raised during on Friday that ultimately preceded the ongoing temporary pause. The other concerns that were raised included potentially massive amounts of civilian casualties in Iran if the U.S. were to
All right, now to new CNN reporting about a key White House meeting President Trump held on Friday focused on the U.S. war with Iran. A U.S. official and a source familiar with the matter tell CNN that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned the president about potential consequences of escalating the war. The sources say Kane is hoping for Frederica. All right, Betsy Klein, keep us posted there from the White House. Thank you. All right, meantime, Iran says it held talks with Oman in Tehran about the Strait of Hormuz over the past 2 days. The U.S. military has continued its naval blockade of Iranian ports. U.S. Central Command posted on social media yesterday that it boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea that violated the blockade. At the same time, a new front in the war is opening in the Red Sea, where Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen have exchanged attacks with Saudi Arabia. That conflict threatening another critical oil corridor. CNN's Nick Robertson joins right now. Nick, we got this apparent U.S. hawk strikes in Iran. How might that impact peace talks overall?
It's an opportunity. We heard from the Iranian Ministry today saying that there was progress, that the talks were constructive, that they continue at a political and technical level. But it's key to understanding the details. We just don't have the talks were all about the Strait of Hormuz, of course. And the key point here is, do the Iranians finally agree that they control the Strait of Hormuz and allow traffic to pass marine traffic and not try to get any tolls and not tell them which passages and paths go down through the Strait of Hormuz? As no indication that happens. It will be the output of that meeting, what the Omanis pass on to the U.S. diplomat, what White House gets back from those talks is going to determine the next moves. Clearly, the implication we've heard from Ambassador Waltz, from the Pentagon, from indications from the White House, is this is a sort of announced temporary ceasefire type deal to make the space for diplomacy. But it's not clear just because you're talking that there's actually going to be an outcome that's good enough for the White House. I think on the Houthi front, the Red Sea, and trying to stop Saudi oil getting out to oil markets, it's having a chilling effect. But as far as we know, the Houthis haven't fired any additional missiles at Saudi infrastructure. So perhaps they're on the run, so perhaps they're taking a beat on all of this at the moment as well. And then tomorrow, Prime Minister Israel, he'll head to the United States a few of them. There's a deal with Trump on Tuesday. Expect the Israeli Prime Minister to thank the president for announcing that Saudi Arabia has to normalize with Israel before it can have this civilian nuclear deal. But also the key thing there will be what intelligence does Prime Minister Netanyahu share with President Trump about Iranian nuclear assets. Where are they? Of course, it was the Israelis that had a lesson about leading towards the Pickaxe Mountain as being a storage facility for the highly enriched uranium and other nuclear storage. So while Prime Minister President Trump's then influence where this war goes next.
All right, very complex. Nick Robertson. Let's continue this conversation. With us now is Ali Reza Nader. He is the president of the Nader Research Group. There is a pause in fighting right now, and Iran is talking with Omanis about the Strait of Hormuz. But I wonder, in your view, what kind of diplomacy talks continue, and with whom? I mean, we heard Mr. Waltz say that the U.S. at the highest levels is still continuing to be part of diplomacy talk. But I wonder, with this whole U.S. military operation, what kind of impact these talks might have.
Thanks for having me. I think both sides really want this to end. The Trump administration realizes that it is stuck in a quagmire, and the economy in Iran is suffering greatly. The regime is under huge pressure and wants to get the most out of its discussions with Washington, D.C. So the last few days of military action we've seen from the United States and from Iran is really meant to increase each side's leverage so they can get a better deal out of these upcoming negotiations. Oman has been a mediator between the two sides. It has a very good relationship with Iran, and will continue to play a big role, I think, in negotiations.
I would say that U.S. tax on civilian infrastructure inside Iran is actually strengthening the regime. Why do you believe that is the case? How do you know that is the case?
Look, before this war started in January, there were huge peaceful protests of the regime. We had a revolutionary movement in Iran that was disrupted by this war. Right now, the U.S. is conducting lots of attacks against military facilities in Iran, but civilians are getting it very hard as well. I'm very concerned about the U.S.-Israeli strategy of destroying Iran's critical water and energy infrastructure, because Iran is the big break of economic and environmental collapse. And the U.S. from these facilities is not going to hurt the regime. It's going to hurt ordinary people. Most of the regime's military assets and its leadership and Iran's political leadership is underground. They're pretty safe from these bombs. The people above ground are getting hurt.
How do you think specifically civilians in Iran are being impacted? Because obviously, pictures are not coming out, nor is sentiment of a lot of Iranian civilians. Can you paint a picture for us, of how life in general is being impacted there in Tehran and in the outskirts as well?
I think life in Iran is hell. Unless you're connected to the regime, life is hell because people in Iran, you hear this a lot, the report we're getting from within Iran. A lot of people expected that the Trump administration would come to their help after thousands of Iranians were massacred by the regime. That help really never came. There was still power is executing innocent people left and right. And this war has demonstrated, I think, the weakness of U.S. military power. And I hope really, for once and all, American policymakers realize that you can't overthrow the regime in Iran through war, through bombs on the air. The people of Iran have to create that change for themselves, and you can't do that while being wrong. All
right, we begin with new development in the U.S. war with Iran. Today, a U.S. source tells CNN military operations with Iran are currently on a hold, and it says we are learning details about a key White House meeting President Trump held Friday focused on the war. A U.S. official and a source familiar with the matter tells CNN that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned the president about potential consequences escalating the war. Sources say Kane gave Trump his military options, but he also expressed concerns about further depletion of the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative consequences ramping up the war. Since that meeting, the U.S. has paused 2 weeks on Iran, but it's unclear if this warning has prompted the lull in the attacks. We've had a team of correspondents around the globe covering these developments. Nick Robertson is in Jerusalem. Let's begin with White House. See more details about this White House meeting.
That's right, Frederica. President Trump spending part of his Friday huddling with top advisors and cabinet officials to discuss the options for an escalation in this 5-month-long war with Iran. But for the last 2 nights, we have seen apparent pause fighting after 13 consecutive days of U.S. strikes on Iran. One U.S. source telling CNN that those attacks are on a hold as they give the diplomatic discussions some time to play out. We heard moments ago from U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, weighing in on that pause. Listen.
I've spoken with Secretary Hegseth. What the president is doing right now, as we've seen all along, is giving some talks some space. Talks are going, they're happening at every level, from the more technical aspect of it all the way to the highest levels, of course, within both the Iranian government and the U.S. government.
Now, in that Friday meeting, we are learning that Vice President J.D. Vance, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, raised concern to the president of possibility of escalation. The president for a week has been threatening massive attacks on Iran. That could critical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, key oil hub of Harg Island. The president has warned that could constitute war crimes. Kane also specifically raised concerns about U.S. munitions stockpile. But heard from spokesman Sean Purnell addressing that. He said, quote, "We have executed multiple successful operations across the U.S. military possesses a deep arsenal of capabilities to protect our people and our interests." Sources say that other concerns were raised to Trump, including the possibility of massive civilian casualties across Iran. The idea of a potential refugee crisis, as well as this conflict potentially spinning into a broader war across the Middle East. There are few people within the president's inner circle who believe that the option he's been given for this escalation would yield results that he's hoping for as he made that path forward.
All right, Betsy Klein, White House. Thank you much. All right, let's go to Nick Robertson now. Do we know how this apparent U.S. pause and strikes with Iran may be impacting
Given the Iranians had a delegation in Tehran on Friday, they left last Saturday. They took about the heard from the initial 6 months. The talks were constructive. Progress was made that they would continue at technical and political levels. So you can hear right there, the language kind of matches what we're getting from White House. But the key details not getting right. The key detail is have the Iranians agree not to try to hold on the Strait of Hormuz, which is the main issue in Tehran. Both countries have got the blockades going at the moment, but hostilities sort of abated. Perhaps President Trump will get more insights from his Minister Netanyahu when he lives here tomorrow, heads to Washington for a few on Instagram, but he'll meet President Trump at the White House on Tuesday. He's very likely to give the president an update on the latest intelligence that this happened. Of course, the intelligence went toward Picas Mountain in Iran, so where Iran may try to secure some of its highly enriched uranium and other tributes and equipment that it uses to enrich uranium. So then he will be nuclear for the president by the Israeli prime minister, who is keen, perhaps it's not say the war continue, but the war pausing where it has to cause him political hardship, and he's got an election coming up. He must be minded to try to find where President Trump there is still work to be done in Iran, perhaps present a roadmap for that. Also looking at President Trump putting sort of a speed bump in that over Saudi Arabia's of a nuclear deal with the United States by saying that Saudi must normalize with Israel before they go ahead. Something the Israeli Prime Minister is grateful for. To give the president wants. That's the space we're in right now.
This morning, CNN has new reporting about a key meeting related to the U.S. war with Iran. A source and U.S. officials visited J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman Kane warned President Trump about potential consequences if he escalates the war. According to those sources, Kane expressed concerns about further depleting the U.S. munition stockpile and other possible negative effects. Now, it's unclear if that's why the U.S. decided to suspend nearly 2 weeks of attacks on Iran. The U.S. military has conducted, or rather continued, its naval blockade of Iranian ports. U.S. command posted on social media that it boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea that violated that blockade. And international diplomat Robertson with us now. It's all happened with President Trump. Is Benjamin Netanyahu first start face-to-face in this war?
Yeah, and it's going to be an important one because Prime Minister Netanyahu has not been happy with the ceasefire that was put in place several months ago, and it's not clear where he stands on the report on where he was speaking to the government this morning. He said that he'd be leaving for Washington tomorrow and that he would be meeting President Trump on Tuesday. That all pending issues were going to be discussed, including so I think everyone here imagines that's pretty much going to be front and center. We've watched Omani diplomacy for the last couple of days. They took a trip, sent a delegation to Iran. They got there Friday, left Saturday. The conversation was about Strait of Hormuz. Of course, what the United States wants to see is Iran relinquish its desire and commitment to having some kind of payment method, sort of continued control over ships coming and going from the Strait of Hormuz. It's not clear Iran has made any headway there. It perhaps was sort of pause has allowed that diplomacy to happen. So the question is, how will the president view the outcome of the conversations that one has had? But you say the United States continuing its blockade. The Iranians do the same, saying that they've stopped 6 ships from going into Hormuz, not by fire, but those ships have been not put at anchor. But the U.S. Central Command said that they have told 12 ships and stopped 12 ships from passing through the Strait of Hormuz over the last few days during the current bout of conflict. So where it goes from here, this really does seem to be a matter of whether policy has been able to take advantage of this pause.
Development in the war with Iran today, a U.S. force held and military operations with Iran are currently on hold. That pause comes as we learn new details about a key White House meeting President Trump held on Friday focused on the war. A U.S. federal analyst familiar with the matter to CNN that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Hayne warned the president about potential consequences of the conflict. The sources rather say Hayne gave Trump his military options. They also expressed concerns about further depletion of the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative implications of ramping the war. And that's what is right now from the White House. Betsy, what more can you tell us about this meeting?
Right, Frederica, this could go down as one of the more consequential meetings of this 5-month-long conflict around now. But President Trump huddling top advisors and cabinet officials on Friday to discuss options for an escalation in this war with Iran. But after that meeting, without strikes after 13 days of attacks. Now, a U.S. source says that military operations are on a hold as they give the diplomatic discussion some time to play out. We heard earlier today from U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, addressing that pause.
Secretary Hegseth. What the president is doing now, as we've seen all along, is giving some talks some space. Talks are ongoing. They're happening at every level, from the more technical aspect of it all the way to the highest levels, of course, both the Iranian government and the U.S. government.
Now, in that Friday meeting, two sources say that both Vice President J.D. Vance and U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Hayne, raised concern at the possibility of an escalation. And we've heard President Trump held a possibility of massive attacks for weeks now. That could be attacks on critical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, as well as that key oil hub of cargo. And doing so, some have warned, could constitute war crimes. One of the other concerns that Hayne raised during that meeting, according to one of sources, was the U.S. munitions stockpile. We heard from Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell. He says in a statement, quote, "We have executed multiple successful operations across commands while ensuring U.S. military possesses a deep arsenal of capabilities to protect our people and our